Chapter 39 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. Those who have remained any time in Dorchester or its neighbourhood will know that within a circle of not many miles diameter around that town there are many spots to be found as wild and solitary as in any part of the island of Great Britain. On the side of Weymouth especially, there are some scenes in the midst of which one might fancy oneself very far removed, indeed, from the high cultivation which closely surrounds them. In the days of James II, when agriculture as a science had made very little advance upon the knowledge possessed by the Anglo-Saxons, and when cultivation had spread but slowly under the influence of a great many deterring causes, these solitary spots were, of course, more numerous in all counties of England, and it was upon one of these in Dorsetshire, not very many miles distant from the capital of that county, that was built an ancient fortified house, dating probably from 2 centuries before. It was placed upon an eminence overhanging a river, brief in its course and utterly unimportant till it reached a point about 5 miles from its mouth, where it widened out into a creek or narrow bay of salt water, which afforded a convenient refuge for fishing boats. Near a spot where the first considerable extension of the banks of the stream took place, a sort of sandy bar had formed itself, marking the navigable from the unnavigable water, and it was just at this point that the house, or castle as it was called, had been built. I will name the river the Orme, and from it, and the sandy bar I have mentioned, the house had derived the name of Ormebar Castle. The ground around was covered with smooth green turf or short but rich grass, disposed in easy undulations, and watered by many a clear and beautiful stream, and such a thing as a hedgerow or a wall was not to be seen for some miles round the enclosure of the park. It was a gloomy-looking building, too, consisting of tall, wide, irregular masses of masonry, put together anyhow, and one could easily see from the outside, from the numerous and very much varied windows, and from the irregular distribution of the chimneys about the house, that in searching for any room within, one might have a real journey to go, in order to reach a door hard by. It was in this curious old building, and amid the solitary scene around, that a little party had met together on the night of Margaret's visit to Hortensia. The kitchen and the hall were well tenanted, better, indeed, than they had been for many a year, for a large household had been transported there from a distant part of the country, and 2 or 3 old servants, who had remained for years in the place, were added to those who had freshly arrived. But in a large, curious, old-fashioned hall above, only 3 persons were seated at the hour of sunset. They were a mother and her 2 sons, and they grouped themselves together near the window, not to watch the passing away of the western light, but upon business which 2 of them at least considered of no light importance. In the midst, on a tall, high-backed, velvet-covered chair, with a footstool under her feet, sat old Lady Coldnam. Her eldest son was on her right hand, looking somewhat listlessly out toward the sea, in a direction where the tower of a little church was just visible over the slope of the ground. His arm was thrown over the back of the chair, his head leaning somewhat on one side, and his whole figure disposed in an attitude of graceful idleness. On the other side appeared his brother Robert, with a very different air. He leaned rather forward than otherwise, with his right hand resting on his knee and his eyes fixed on his mother, as if watching for some oracular word from her lips. At length, as the day began to grow dim, Robert inquired, "Shall I call for lights, madam?" "No," replied Lady Coldnam. "I love this sort of light, and enjoy seeing the stars come out one by one, when darkness resumes her sway over the earth, like a powerful monarch triumphing in stern, proud serenity over some weak and glittering pretender who had disputed his sway. Besides, Robert, it is full as well to talk of all we have to notice under the shadow." She paused and relapsed into silence again, and then, when the sky was nearly dark, she said, "You have done your part well, Robert, and now we must make sure that the blow goes home. You have lodged him in prison as you promised, but he must die." "I think you may leave that to the care of the good old lord," replied Robert. "He is as eager for his blood as a hound for the blood of a deer." "I will leave it to no one with entire trust," replied Lady Coldnam. "Too much depends upon him to have anything risked upon the conduct of a blundering old man, or a heedless, inattentive lawyer." "I wonder what poor Ralph has done," said Lord Coldnam, breaking silence for the first time during a quarter of an hour, "to make you two so bitterly his enemies. One pursues him like a bloodhound, and the other says he must die." Lady Coldnam fixed her large dark eyes upon him with a look of angry astonishment, but the young lord had long been growing somewhat restive, and he repeated, "I wonder what he has done, I say. What is his fault, I should like to know?" "He is his father's son," said Lady Coldnam with stern emphasis. "I did not know that was any greater crime than being one's mother's son, but rather thought it a virtue," said Lord Coldnam with a light laugh. "As to the father, I don't see much harm in him any more than in Ralph. He is a very good sort of old gentleman, rather pedantic, it is true, but not much the worse for that. Shrews, pedants, and libertines are, I suppose, necessary evils in our state of society, and as I don't approve of persecuting them, I think I had better leave this somewhat intolerant council and amuse myself elsewhere." As he spoke, he rose, but Lady Coldnam exclaimed in a fierce, stern voice, "Sit down, Lord Coldnam." "No, indeed, dear mother," replied the young lord, "I can employ myself better. There is Robert, who is peculiarly fond of either sitting or running. Which was it you did at Sedgemoor, Bob? I'm too active for one and too idle for the other, and so, with your blessing, I will walk." Lady Coldnam eyed him with an expression of anger, surprise, and contempt, which could hardly be described, but the young lord had chosen his part, and, though idle enough in his habits, he was resolute. His mother's look nettled him a little too, and he said, in a cool but determined tone, "In a word, dear lady and mother, I am of age, I think, and master at least of my own actions. I do not desire particularly to be master even of my own house, as long as it has got so much better a master in it. But I will not be here consenting to things that I disapprove and dislike, let it cost what it may." "Hark you, Coldnam," cried his mother, as he moved toward the door, "a word in your ear, if you please." He bent down his head, listening gravely, and the lady whispered something to him, gradually raising her voice till the last words became distinct and audible enough. They were, "and leave you a beggar and an outcast at a word." "Do it," said Lord Coldnam, with the most indifferent tone in the world, and quietly sauntered out of the room. Lady Coldnam shut her teeth tight together, and the violent emotion that was going on within might be seen by the close clinching of her beautiful white hands as they lay upon her knee. But she made no comment, and perhaps was sorry for the words she uttered. They had not escaped the ears of Robert Woodall, and he might build upon them some strange expectations. But he was wisely silent. Coldnam resumed the conversation, saying, "Let us think no more of that foolish boy's caprices. You are a rational being, Robert. Tell me what you think of this case. Are we certain of getting a condemnation?" "Really, I do not know, dear lady," he answered, and then added, with some emphasis, "that must depend upon the judge and the jury." "They must both be taken care of," said Lady Coldnam, slowly nodding her head. "I will crave an audience of his lordship when he first arrives. He will not refuse me. You must see to the jury, Robert, and if the youth be really guilty, there surely can be no great difficulty in proving him so. Tell me, upon your honour and soul, do you really think he committed the deed?" "Upon my honour and soul I do," replied Robert Woodall, and for once in his life he spoke the truth. Nay, more, he carried his frankness further, adding, "But I do not doubt that it was all done fairly. Ralph, I have heard, was reputed the best fencer in his college, and the best quarterstaff man in all Lincolnshire. 3 or 4 passes would soon settle the matter with Henry, without any foul play. That letter of Henry's, too, written with his absurd generosity, clears away all suspicious circumstance. That is the worst point of the case against us, for juries are not fond of condemning men for duels when no unfairness is proved." "Cannot the letter be suppressed?" inquired his mother. Her son shook his head, and she went on to ask, "Is it in Lord Woodall's hands?" "No, in the Duke of Norfolk's," answered her son. "He gave the old lord a copy, but he kept the original." "This is frightful," said the old lady in an undertone. "He will escape us yet. The only chance is with the jury, Robert. There must be 2 or 3 sturdy men found among them who will starve the others out and get us a verdict. Hark! There are horses' feet. That must be the old lord himself. He promised to bring a great lawyer with him who will enter into our views. But mind, be not too rash. Speak not too plainly, boy, for these men sometimes take fire when their own image is shown them in too perfect a glass, and they assume a fresh honesty but to show us that our thoughts of them were calumnious." "No fear of my being too rash," replied Robert Woodall. "Besides, I shall apply myself principally to this business with Margaret. It seemed to me the old lord wavered before her steadiness, but I will not be kept in suspense. I will know at once whether he intends to keep his oath or not." "There is business on hand," said Lady Coldham very gravely, "more serious than any pretty painted puppet in the world." "Ay, but the estates, mother," said her son. "True," she answered. "True, the estates." And at that same moment Lord Woodall entered the room, followed by a man in dark clothing whom he presented to Lady Coldham as Counsellor Armitage. The conversation was led at once to the predominant subject in the thoughts of all, and was discussed for some time, principally by Lord Woodall, Robert, and Lady Coldham, who stated briefly but distinctly the new-born fears of failure which her son's previous words had suggested. The lawyer, who had listened attentively but had spoken little, now interposed, saying, "Do not be afraid, Lady Coldham. We will take care that justice shall be done, and if, through the weakness of a jury, it could not be done in one way, it would be done in another. It matters little for the true cause of justice what are the means employed, so that the end be favourable to herself. We will reach him, depend upon it. Let him attempt to conceal the facts if he will, and if he can. The case of the slaughter once clearly proved against him, we must overcome the scruples of the jury, and if not, it does not much matter." "Does not much matter," said Lady Coldham with a stare. "I do not understand you, sir." "I am instructed for the Crown, Lady Coldham, and that is the reason why a great number do not understand me," replied Mr. Armitage, with a slight smile at what he imagined to be a jest. "All I can say is, you shall be satisfied, and this good lord too. The young man has evidently committed a great crime, and it shall not be the foolish lenity of a jury that shall save him." "No, I trust there is no chance of that," said old Lord Woodall. "He killed my son, and I will have justice. Now I have found him, I will never leave him till I have justice. I am an old man to take such a journey as this from London to Dorchester in 3 days, but the spirit that brought me down here will support me to follow him all over the world till I have justice upon his head." "There will be plenty to second you, my noble lord," said Robert Woodall. "I, for one, cannot rest satisfied so long as this man is with me on the earth, for it is very clear to me now that I shall never have the love of my promised bride so long as he lives." Lord Woodall was silent, and Robert Woodall, finding that his indirect mode of proceeding produced no reply, asked boldly, "If she persists in her refusal, what do you intend to do, my lord?" "Keep my word, young man," replied the old lord drily, and then turning to Lady Coldham, he inquired, "Where is your eldest son, madam? I thought to find him here." "Oh, never mind him," replied Lady Coldham. "He is in the house, but can see, with his idle whims, he is more likely to spoil all than to help in anything. He is better out of the way. As to Margaret," she continued, "you must let me see her, my good lord. Women can often find means of persuasion where men fail." "See her if you like, Lady Coldham," replied the old lord, "but it will make little difference. I have pledged my word, and it shall be kept. She must obey. But as to your son, I am sorry he goes not with us in this business. What is the reason?" "Oh, none," replied Lady Coldham. "Old affection for this young man, I believe. Depend upon it, he is better out of our counsels. And now, sir," she continued, turning to Mr. Armitage, "will you explain to me clearly how the case stands? What are its chances, and what remains to be done to make chances secure? Remember, I am accustomed to deal with lawyers, and will not be put off with ambiguities." She had hardly uttered these words, in a stern masculine tone, when a loud voice, rich and deep and full, was heard saying, "Beware once more, I tell you. Catherine, beware." The 3 gentlemen looked round, for the speaker seemed to be in the room, but no one was to be seen. and Robert's voice soon called attention another way, as he exclaimed, "Good God, my mother has fainted!" It was long before Lady Coldham could be brought to herself, and for a time those who surrounded her thought she was dead, so still and breathless did she lie, and so cold did her hands become. Lord Coldham was sent for in haste, but he could not be found, and the only intelligence that could be obtained regarding him was that he had been speaking to a tall old gentleman in the gateway, and that shortly after he had ordered his horse and ridden away. The attempts to recall Lady Coldham to life at length proved successful, but she was in no state to continue the conversation, and the party separated, Robert Woodall promising to visit his noble relation on the following day. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. The court assembled in the town of Dorchester, and the notorious Jeffreys, with his gross, ferocious face, took his place upon the bench. Several trials for treason were entered into in the morning, and dispatched with terrible rapidity. Death! Death! Death was the news brought to the prison every hour, and each man awaited his doom as his character permitted. The court was crowded to suffocation, and most of the magistrates of the county were assembled near the bench. There were several clergymen among them, but one in particular seemed much interested in the course of the proceedings. He was a stout, tall, portly man of the middle age, with bright, twinkling eyes and a smooth, rosy countenance. He moved frequently on his seat, often looked toward the dock and the jury, and sometimes cast his eyes with an inquisitive glance at the paper of notes which lay before the judge, from whom he was not very far distant. At length the case of Ralph Woodall was called on, and before the prisoner was brought into the dock, the good clergyman I have mentioned approached the judge, and was seen to whisper to him with a paper in his hand. Jeffreys turned round, bent his beetle brows upon him, and surveyed him from head to foot. "I thought it was some Presbyterian knave," he said aloud, "and not a clergyman of the establishment. What do you come here for, sirrah? Like a straw witness to bring off the guilty?" "No, faith, my lord," replied Dr. Maffili with a laugh, and perfectly undismayed by the menacing aspect of the judge. "I came according to my duty as a magistrate, and, moreover, to get your advice about this little bit of paper, and perhaps to drink a bottle with you, or maybe two, after you have done the hanging and quartering, if you should be good-humoured enough to ask me to dinner. We have drank a bottle together before now at the Mitre, when you were a little man, and I not much bigger. I paid for it, too, by the same token. But what am I to do with this paper?" "It's not evidence, knave," thundered Jeffreys, unable to restrain himself under the half-suppressed merriment of the court. "Is the witness forthcoming? Is he dead? Is he buried? Is he gone to the devil by your ghostly counsels? It is not evidence, sir. Take it away, and yourself too, for fear I have the gown stripped off your back. You shall not long disgrace the bench." "Faith, my lord, if I do, I am not the only one," replied Dr. Maffili, walking away. But, ere he had taken many steps, pushing a path through his fellow magistrates, Jeffreys recollected himself a little, and called out aloud, "Here, fellow, you parson, give me the paper, let me look at it." Dr. Maffili seemed to be suddenly stricken with a fit of deafness, and walked on deliberately, but those whom he was passing at the moment heard him say, as if to himself, "Don't I know better? He's just in a humour to tear everything to pieces. Why not this? No, no, I know what I will do." And getting into the court below, he forced his way to a spot just behind Mr. Daines, and spoke to him in a whisper over his shoulder. Mr. Daines in turn whispered to an elderly counsellor before him, who turned round his grave, hard-lined face and said, "Good, we will use it in some way, if need be. The very tendency will have its effect upon the jury." Dr. Maffili remained standing where he was during the whole of the events which succeeded, although his fat sides suffered severely from the pressure of the crowd. The little incident of the sparring between the parson and the judge had withdrawn the attention of the spectators from the dock, and when heads were turned round and eyes bent in that direction, Ralph Woodall was seen standing between two jailers. Everyone knows the impression produced by a fine person and dignified bearing, even upon a court of justice, and as the young gentleman stood there, his handsome face, athletic form, and calm, resolute demeanour had no slight influence in his favour. He fixed his eyes for a moment or two upon the judge, and let them run round the court. There was no loved face to greet him, no look of encouragement for his support, nothing but a sea of unknown, indifferent faces gazing at him as an object of curiosity. Some forms were gone through, and then at once the counsel for the prisoner rose. Jeffreys would fain have refused to listen to him at that stage of the proceedings, but he insisted, and the harsh judge knew his man too well, his firmness, his quiet, persevering courage, and his profound knowledge of law, to resist too far. He was permitted to speak, and at once took an objection to the competence of the court. He pointed out that the venue had not been changed, and that the case ought to be tried in Norfolk. It required but little argument to show that the law of the land was entirely on his side, and that argument was placed in the plainest and briefest form. Jeffreys was furious. He looked over his desk to a little man sitting near his feet, and asked him a question. The reply was in a very low and humble tone, but it stirred up the wrath of the judge still higher. His face became actually purple, and he poured forth upon the poor man's head a torrent of invective, of which the words knave, villain, and pitiful impostor were the lightest ornaments. A vast string of very blasphemous oaths was added, and then, having thus vented his first fury, he consulted for a few moments with the counsel for the crown, whom he beckoned up, and then, raising his great coarse voice as if addressing the whole court, he said, "Look you here now, see what law is, and how carefully it protects the subject. There stands a murderer, a man who should not be suffered to cumber the face of earth 1 hour longer than needful, a bad fellow, always a bad fellow from his cradle, and yet some of the officers of the crown, drunken knaves, I warrant, having neglected, or perhaps been bribed to neglect, their duty in a matter of mere form, a thing of no moment. This fellow thinks that he will protract his life for some miserable months to come. He must be a cowardly villain to wish to live on in a prison." "I wish a fair trial by a just judge," said Ralph in a firm, loud tone, which startled even Jeffreys. "Hold your tongue, knave," cried the judge. "We will fit you. You shall be disappointed of your fine project. You may gain a few hours, but no more. You shall be hanged before I quit Dorchester, if I live. See here now, what a fellow this is. There are no less than 3 charges against this man. 1 for murder, cold-blooded, premeditated murder, 1 under the statute regarding conformity, and 1 for high treason. The indictment is ready, but he must have a copy and time to read it. Oh yes, he shall have a copy, but we will fit him." Then, leaning forward a little, he looked full at Ralph's counsel and said bitterly, "You have gained so much for your man, sir, and you shall not say I overstepped the law. Oh no, sir, you strive to withdraw him from justice, but you shan't succeed." "You mistake, my lord," replied the counsel. "I have no intention of charging you with overstepping the law, and still more do you mistake in supposing that I wish to withdraw this honourable and noble-minded young man from fair trial and justice. Had I done so, I should have taken another course. As the venue is laid in Dorsetshire, and the indictment, on its very face, alleges the crime charged to have been committed in Norfolk, I should have suffered the trial to proceed to a verdict, and then pointed out the flaw in the indictment. But in consultation with this honourable and very high-spirited gentleman last night, I agreed, at his suggestion, to raise the objection at once, in order to show that he shrunk not from a fair trial, but only claimed the same rights as other British subjects." "Silence, sir, silence! Sit down this instant!" exclaimed Jeffreys. "Gaoler, remove the prisoner, and keep him in safe custody. Call on another." Several persons left the court from the outskirts of the crowd, and Dr. Maffili elbowed his way out with difficulty, taking the paper he had brought in his pocket. Tidings of what had occurred spread to various houses in the vicinity, to the great inn, and to the temporary dwelling of Hortensia Danvers, and various were the feelings which the intelligence that Ralph Woodall's trial for murder had been put off, on account of an error in the indictment, excited in the bosoms of the many persons interested. Lord Woodall received the news with stern bitterness, and said little, but remained gloomy, dark, and silent, till Robert Woodall joined him with a very cheerful face. "Well, what think you of this?" said the old lord. "You seem gay, young man." "Because everything is going well, my lord," replied Robert Woodall. "We have 10 times the chances of getting a verdict against him, as things stand at present, on the charge of high treason, than we should have had upon the charge of murder. Armitage says that he would most certainly have been acquitted, that poor Henry's letter would be quite sufficient. I told you how refractory the jury were last night, and those who know them say that at least 5 of them would have held out for acquittal, even if they had died of starvation. It not being a state case, the jury was badly struck, but upon the charge of treason Armitage declares he is perfectly certain. Armitage says they are condemning everybody, and when once they have got a taste of blood, they will go on." "It vexes me," said the old lord with a dissatisfied look. "He should be hanged for Henry's death and nothing else. A gross and culpable act of negligence has been committed, and the clerk, or whoever he is, should be discharged and punished." "Councillor Armitage declares it is very well as it is," says Robert, adding, with a laugh, "he vows that he saw the flaw and would not notice it, because he knew we should fail of conviction. But I don't believe he did see it, or even looked at the indictment. The charge of treason, however, will succeed, depend upon it, and if it should not, by any chance, we have still another left to go upon with a better chance of success." Lord Woodall, however, was still dissatisfied, and would not be convinced that it made no difference whether Ralph Woodall was condemned for another offence or for the murder of his son. He drew a distinction which Robert Woodall, only anxious to destroy an enemy, could not at all perceive. Knowing how impossible it was to move him in any opinion which he had once taken up, he at length left him, but did not even ask to see Margaret, for he knew there was little to be hoped from an interview at that moment. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. It was night when, in a large airy chamber of the great inn, where Lord Woodall had taken up his abode on his arrival in Dorchester, Margaret sat side by side with Hortensia, who had quietly entered the room a moment before. The faces of both were pale from anxiety, and from thought fixed intensely upon one subject. It was the day of Ralph's trial for high treason, and both were well aware, Hortensia more especially, that Ralph had never had any share whatever in Monmouth's rebellion. They had not met till then, during the whole day, and each had looked upon the charge somewhat lightly, and entertained but small doubts that upon that, at least, Ralph would be acquitted. As the day passed on, however, and messenger after messenger brought tidings from the court to each, their feelings had become very different, and they were startled and astounded by the evidence which was produced. It was proved by Hortensia's own servants that Ralph had come to Danvers's new church during her absence, that he had been found in her park in close communication with a notorious rebel, then actually levying war against the crown, one Thomas Dare, that very shortly after this Dare appeared in Taunton, and raised the people of that town in favour of Monmouth, and that he boasted publicly there that he had assurances of Lady Danvers's tenantry joining the Duke. This was enough to shake Hortensia's confidence, to agitate, to terrify her. But another messenger had followed soon after, bringing her the news that 2 of her servants had sworn to the fact of Ralph having had a long private interview with Monmouth in her house during her absence, and that Mr. Drayton himself had sworn to the same. Then she heard that 2 more of her people had deposed that, on leaving Ralph at the door of her house, the Duke had turned to him, saying, "Remember my commission, I trust to you," and that Ralph replied, "I will not fail your grace." Hortensia herself, though she easily conceived the words to be innocent, did not understand to what they could apply, and she evidently saw the chain, which bound the victim, being drawn tighter and tighter around him. Then came the evidence of his having been on the road to Axminster when Monmouth was actually in combat with the royal troops, and then of his having been taken on the very field of Sedgemoor. She knew that many a one had already been condemned upon evidence slighter than this, and her heart failed her. The summing up, too, of the judge had been brought to her with tolerable accuracy, and she perceived how skilfully he had pieced out the evidence against the unfortunate prisoner, not only indulging in violent abuse of him, but attributing to him much to which none of the witnesses testified. Ralph's defence had been simple and straightforward. He told the facts just as they had occurred, plainly and straightforwardly. He pointed out that the Duke of Monmouth had come to Danvers's new church with a considerable body of men, whom he had no power of opposing, even if he had been personally cognizant of them being in rebellion. That the Duke had left with him a sealed letter for Lady Danvers, which he believed had come from the young Baroness Wentworth, charging him to deliver it as soon as possible, and that the words which had passed between them at the door referred solely to that. At all this Jeffreys scoffed in his summing up, declaring it to be a trumped-up story which would not deceive an oyster-wench. It was clear, he contended, as clear as anything under the sun, that Ralph had held friendly communication with the rebel and his agents, had agreed to assist him, and had endeavoured to induce Lady Danvers to take part in the same criminal proceeding. Doubtless, he said, the young knave entrapped her to go to Axminster for the purpose of entangling her with the insurrection, so that she could not draw back. Either her ladyship's good sense or her good fortune, said Jeffreys, kept her out of the scrape, but with that we have nothing to do at present. The case is against this young felon in all senses of the word, guilty beyond a doubt of 1,000 different crimes. He then hypocritically declared he left the case entirely in the hands of the jury, though he could not have any doubts as to the verdict they would bring in. Poor Hortensia! Despair took possession of her when these tidings were brought to her solitary room. She did not fail to perceive how the evidence might be made to bear against herself, but she gave that hardly a moment's thought. Her whole mind was fixed upon the fate of Ralph, and after pondering gloomily for a few minutes, she started up suddenly, saying, "I will go and see her, let the old man behave as he will." And calling her maid, she hastened away to the inn, where she now sits with poor Margaret, not exactly alone, for the two maids are there, standing at a little distance, and entering partially into the feelings of those whom they served. Old Lord Woodall had gone forth several hours before to the court, for his disappointment at the result of the first charge against Ralph had but stimulated his eagerness, and he could not rest satisfied without watching the progress of events. When once there, the interest increased upon him. He was torn, it is true, by various contending feelings. He could not see the gallant young man, whom he had loved only less than his own children in former years, stand there in the dock defending his life with calm dignity and firmness, without feeling emotions he strove hard to crush. But when he thought of his own brave, high-spirited boy, and persuaded himself that Ralph's hand had killed him, returning affection was changed again to gall and bitterness. The interest was but the deeper, however, from this contention. He stayed out the examination of all the witnesses. He stayed out the prisoner's defence and the judge's summing up, and now, with the greater part of the auditory, he was lingering still in the court to hear the verdict of the jury, who had retired to deliberate. The time was one of anxious suspense to all, but to none more terrible than to Margaret and Hortensia. From time to time they would send out a maid to inquire, or one of Lady Danvers's servants would put his head in and say, "No verdict yet, my lady." Hortensia bore it all firmly, and apparently calmly, though her anxious eye and pale cheek belied the tranquillity of her manner. Poor Margaret could hardly bear up at all. Often the tears would not be restrained, and the long protracted suspense kept her only under increasing agony. At length there was a noise and bustle of confusion in the street, and a hasty step was heard running up the stairs. The moment after the door opened quickly, and Mr. Drayton himself appeared. His face was sufficient answer to all inquiries. It was pale, haggard, ghastly, and full of deep grief. "Speak!" cried Hortensia, "speak!" "Condemned, madam," replied the steward solemnly, "and partly upon my testimony. But indeed I could not help it. I only told the truth." The words had hardly passed his lips, and Margaret's head had fallen forward on the table, with her eyes deluging her fair hands with tears, when Lord Woodall entered the room with a slow and somewhat feeble step. He was a very much altered man. His eyes were fixed upon the floor, his look grave and sad, his whole aspect downcast and sorrowful. Oh, how often does fruition bring to strong passion ashes and bitterness! He was sated. The fierce desire of his heart was gratified. The man upon whom he sought vengeance was condemned to a terrible death. The awful words rang in his ear. He saw the gallant youth stand firm and unshaken while they were uttered. He saw him wave his hand as he left the dock, and say as calmly as if he had been going to his rest, "Farewell all. Remember, I die innocent. Remember." Remorse and pity had touched the old man's heart. For the first time he doubted the guilt of the man he had persecuted, and as he sank into a chair, his first words were, "Poor Ralph." Margaret's ear caught those friendly sounds, and springing up with a wild gesture of entreaty, she cast herself at her father's feet, exclaiming, "Oh, save him! Save him!" The old man shook his head sorrowfully and replied in a very low tone, "It is in vain, my child. I cannot even interfere to save the slayer of my son." "Oh, he did not! He did not!" cried Margaret vehemently. "It is all false, a device of that traitor's. Ralph would have died ere he injured Henry." "You have been deluded, Lord Woodall," said Lady Danvers, wiping her tears from her eyes, "and if the trial for murder had taken place, you would have seen that your poor young kinsman is innocent. I can give testimony as to the impossibility of his ever having drawn his sword against your son, for I know where he was, and can account for every moment of his time, from 9 o'clock of that fateful morning till the deed was done. Lord Woodall, if you had any share in bringing about this condemnation, now exert yourself to the utmost to save this young man's life, or I will, ere 2 days are over, lay before you such evidence of his innocence as shall fill you with horror and remorse until the last day of your existence." "Can you so?" asked the old man, gazing at her. "Is it so doubtful as that?" "It is not doubtful in the least," replied Hortensia, almost sternly. "He did not do it. It was impossible for him to do it. Stay with him, Margaret. Cease not to plead until you have wrung it from him. I have heard some of the doings in this case, and know how much influence he has exerted and can exert. I will away at once to another quarter and see what can be done there. When I return, I will bring with me those who can show your father where Ralph Woodall spent every moment of his time on the day of your brother's death, which he did not pass with me. They are now in the town, though they would have come too late had he been tried 3 days ago." Thus saying, she hurried away, followed by her maid, and on the stairs passed Robert Woodall with a look of contempt and horror which she could not hide. The young man doffed his hat and smiled with one of those meaning serpent looks which often accompanied with him a sense of triumphant cunning. He walked on to the room in which Margaret and her father had been left together, but merely opened the door and looked in. Then, seeing her at her father's feet, he bowed his head slowly to Lord Woodall and retired. The sight of him made the old man start, and he gazed round vacantly for a moment, as if looking for something. It was some resource he looked for his mind was greatly troubled. At length some sudden scheme seemed to strike him, and he grasped his child's hand in his. "Margaret, my child, Margaret," he cried, "you can save him. You can save all, him, me, all of us, if you will. I have promised your hand to your cousin Robert. I have pledged him my honour and my faith. I have imprecated the curse of heaven upon my head if I do not keep my word. Now, Margaret, now give your consent. Promise to be Robert's, and I will do my best to save this young man." Margaret started up and gazed upon her father, silent, with a look of icy horror. "Oh, God!" she exclaimed at length. "What is it my father imposes on me?" Then she raised her hand to her brow and pressed it tight, as if to still the throbbing of her brain. "You will do your best to save him?" she said, gazing wildly in the old man's face. "I will save him. He shall be saved," exclaimed Lord Woodall vehemently. "If not, your promise shall be void. Do you consent, Margaret? Consent, my child, consent. Your old father beseeches and entreats his child to save him from dishonour and from remorse, and this young man from death." Margaret clasped her hands together and raised her eyes on high, as if praying to heaven for help. But then she placed her right hand in her father's and said in a low, sad, solemn tone, but with every word marked and distinct, "On that condition I do consent, but give me time, you must give me time," and she added in a lower tone, "to die." "You shall have time, ample time. Thanks, my dear child," said Lord Woodall, kissing her, but when he withdrew his arms again, Margaret fell senseless on the floor. The maid, who had been in the room during the whole scene, ran hastily to her mistress's aid, and poor Margaret was removed to her own chamber, still in a state from which it was cruelty to rouse her. "Send for a doctor, bring her to herself," said the old lord. "I will away as speedily as possible, and see the judge. He has blank pardons in his pocket, they say, ready signed, which he tosses about among boon companions in a drinking bout. I must find him forthwith, though doubtless he is now at his revels. Tell her where I am gone. That will please her." Thus saying, he sped away, and when Lady Danvers returned about 3/4 of an hour after, with a young man and an elderly woman, she found the room vacant. Inquiring further, and leaving her 2 companions behind her, she sought out Margaret's chamber. The fair, beautiful girl was lying on the bed, as pale as death, and with her eyes still closed, but Hortensia could see by a tear which trickled through the lids, and gemmed the long, dark lashes, that she had been recalled to sense and suffering. Her maid was now with her alone, and making a sign to Lady Danvers not to speak aloud, she advanced, and said in a whisper that her poor mistress was better, but that the least effort made her fall into a fainting fit again. In the same tone she communicated to Hortensia all that had occurred. "Poor girl," said Hortensia, clasping her hands together, "what hast thou done? They have been very cruel to thee. Thou hast done all to save him thou lovest, but at the expense of peace and happiness, and perhaps life." It is probable Margaret heard the murmur of her voice, but she stirred not in the least, and Hortensia quitted the room in deep sadness. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. A large table was set in a rich and costly room, and round it were seated a number of persons very dignified in station, but certainly not at that moment very dignified in demeanour. At the head of the table was an elderly gentleman, well fattened and of rubicund face, which had evidently lost none of its roses by the accessories of the meal. This was Mr. Mayor, entertaining the judges at supper. On his right hand sat Lord Chief Justice Jeffreys, with his wig a good deal on one side, a curious sort of tightness about one corner of his mouth, and a depression of the other corner, as if he had been slightly affected by palsy. There was a merry leer in his eyes, however, and a robustious jollity about his whole appearance, which contrasted strangely with his savage and ferocious look upon the bench. Yes, it did afford a strange contrast, but yet it was nothing compared with the harsh, jarring discord of his light, licentious levity at the table, when closely opposed to the savage cruelty which occupied the morning. There he was, laughing and drinking and jesting and singing immediately after having condemned 60 of innocent men to death. Judges, like undertakers, I believe, get hardened to the idea of death. "How many are you going to pardon, my lord?" asked the worthy mayor, with a half-suppressed hiccup. "That depends upon their circumstances, Master Mayor," replied Jeffreys, with a broad laugh. "That young man, I hope," said the good-natured magistrate. "I mean the Mr. Woodall, who was convicted of seeing Monmouth before the rebellion broke out. His case was not half as bad as the rest, and he seemed a fine young fellow." "His case will be worse before Saturday night," said Jeffreys. "A knave, an errant knave, sir. Why, they tell me his father is not worth 500 a year. Was there ever such a knave? By God's wounds! The son of such a knave ought to hang for having such a father, and the father ought to hang for having such a son. Ha! What is this? Say, I am supping. I will not be disturbed. I have done work enough for one day, and cut out work enough for a few others." "The lady says she must and will see you, my lord," replied the servant, to whom his last words were addressed, and who the moment before had slipped a note into his hand. "Ha! A lady!" cried Jeffreys, with a leer round the table. "We must see the lady. Is she young, fellow? Is she pretty?" "Quite beautiful, sir," replied the man. "And such a dress!" "'Twill do," cried the judge. "Show her into a private room. Quite private, and I will come to her anon. I must steady myself, gentlemen, I must steady myself. I'll even drink a cup of water. That is the most steadying thing I know." And after a moment's thought, Jeffreys rose and walked out of the room coolly and straightly enough, for it required an infinite quantity of strong drink to produce anything more in him than a sort of boisterous merriment, in which he strangely forgot all dignity and propriety. As the reader has probably by this time supposed, the person whom he found waiting for him was Lady Danvers. She was accompanied by her maid, however, and 2 of her men were stationed at the door of the room. "My lord," she said as soon as he entered, "I am glad to see you. You have condemned my young friend Ralph Woodall this day. I come to intercede for him." "All in vain, my lady, all in vain," said Jeffreys, glancing his eye at the maidservant. "Found guilty by a jury, he can expect no mercy." Hortensia had spoken very calmly, and she knew the man too well to let him see any agitation. "Why not?" she asked in the same quiet tone. "If his guilt were proved, which you, my lord, know quite well it is not, and which I deny, still he would be very much less culpable than any of the others whom you have condemned. You must, and of course will, pardon some, in mere compassion to the executioner. Is it not right, then, to choose the least guilty? Alice, go to the door and stay with the 2 men. Shut the door, remember." Jeffreys grinned, for he saw that Lady Danvers was now coming to the point. "I do not mean to say," he answered, "that this young man's guilt is quite as atrocious as that of some others, but—" "The levying of a severe fine," replied Hortensia, "will meet the justice of the case better than execution." "That may be, ma'am," said Jeffreys, "but the law says death." "One is bound and justified to evade the law in the cause of mercy, where law is too severe," replied Hortensia. "You have, my lord, I understand, received from the king, with a view to such very cases as these, a number of pardons signed in blank, in order to prevent a waste of time in referring to him. Now I can see, by what you admit, that you judge this young man is worthy of one of these pardons, and the only question is, what is the fine you think sufficient? If the strict letter of the law prevents you from commuting the sentence openly to a fine, the money can be paid quite privately, justice be satisfied, and yet no deviation from the law appear." "Madam, they should send you ambassador to the hardest-headed court in Europe," said Jeffreys, with a laugh. "The worst feature, however, of this case is, the young man is too poor to pay a fine. There is nothing to levy upon." "Oh, I beg your pardon," replied Hortensia. "There are the purses of his friends, and let me tell you, my lord, he has many not only rich, but powerful friends. The Duke of Norfolk crossed the whole country 4 days ago to give evidence on the trial for murder, and remained in Dorchester till that part of the matter was settled." "Aye, that's the worst of the whole business," said Jeffreys. "Were it not for that, we might content ourselves with levying a fine of 10 or 20,000 pounds. "Nay, nay," exclaimed Hortensia, "say 5. 10 at the least," said the judge. 10 at the least, and he shook his head decidedly. "Well, 10 be it," replied the lady. "Do we understand each other?" "Not quite," replied Jeffreys, "for what's the use of saving his head from treason if it is to be touched for murder? Besides, it's only fair to tell you, putting all roundabouts aside, that the king will have Lord Woodall satisfied in this matter. His son has been killed in a duel of a very irregular kind, and the old man is furious." "Not so furious as he was," answered Hortensia. "His son has been killed, but not by Ralph Woodall. The case would have failed against him, my lord, for there is evidence in this town to show that it was impossible he could have been on the spot where the duel took place for at least 2 hours after the occurrence." "I thought there was something of that sort in the bottom of it," said Jeffreys. "But what then? He will have to be tried for that, and these things are uncertain, my lady." "If such evidence is laid before Lord Woodall as to make him see clearly that the young gentleman is innocent, and he desires to desist from the prosecution, and even joins in our application for pardon in this other case, and if the same evidence convinces the Attorney-General that there is really no case to go to the jury, is there no means?" "Oh, yes," replied Jeffreys. "Mr. Attorney can enter a nolle prosequi at any stage of the proceedings. But do you think that the old lord will really sue for his pardon? I saw him last night, and he was as fierce as ever." "He did not know anything of what he now knows, or will know in a few hours," replied Hortensia. "His heart is already melted, and if it is clearly proved to him that Ralph is in truth innocent, he will be the first to apply to the Crown himself for a pardon." A change came over Jeffreys's face, and he muttered between his teeth, "We must stop that. That would never do." Hortensia saw how her words affected him, and she hastened to take advantage of the impression. Leaning a little forward, she spoke a few words to Jeffreys in a whisper, to which he replied in the same tone. Then she put some question to him again, and he answered aloud, "Oh, to my man Silas Jones. He was once a Presbyterian knave, but I have converted him into an honest churchman. He dare not finger anything that belongs to me, so pay it to him." "And he will have the pardon ready?" said Hortensia. "Ay, ay," answered the judge, "by 9:30 in the morning. But remember, my lady, I must have Lord Woodall's approval." "That shall be done," answered Hortensia, for she had good hope that, even if the old lord remained obdurate, the judge, having been brought thus far, might by the same means be brought one step further. "Farewell, my good lord," she added, when about to retire, but Jeffreys extended his hand, saying, "Let me kiss that lovely hand, divine Lady Danvers." She repressed the inclination to shudder, and gave him her hand, over which he bent his head with a look of maudlin admiration. "That is a lovely ring," said Jeffreys, pointing to a remarkably large diamond which she wore upon her middle finger. Hortensia immediately took it off and presented it to him, saying, "Take it, my lord, and wear it in remembrance of this interview, in which you have been induced to show mercy, and whenever you look upon it, let the remembrance produce the same result." Jeffreys took it reverently, and placed it on his fat little finger, but I very much fear that it never reminded him of mercy with any result. When Hortensia was gone, he returned to the table, and sitting down by the mare, soon turned the conversation with the good-natured magistrate to the subject of Ralph Woodall. For I must pass over all the jests that took place with regard to his interview with a lady, and the allusions to the diamond ring upon his finger, which he rather encouraged than otherwise. Mr. Mayor again urged his remonstrances in regard to Ralph Woodall, saying, "I do really, my lord, wish you would think of that case." "Well, well, I will," replied Jeffreys, "at your request, Mr. Mayor. But if you get me to take compassion upon him, your worship will be the first mayor that ever moved George Jeffreys." "Had you not better respite him, my lord?" said the mayor. "Ay, that can be done tomorrow," said Jeffreys, "according as I determine. It won't do him any harm to have one day of hanging, drawing, and quartering. My life for it, he'll be seeing his bowels in the hands of the hangman all night long. But I'll think of it, Mr. Mayor, for your sake. Now another glass, if you please, and that shall be the last upon my honour, the last but 4. Armitage, you are as dull as a swine to-night. There's a pardon for you, and that fat Presbyterian knave whom you convicted this morning, of buying arms to supply the rebels. The fellow is an armourer by trade, but that makes no difference. He had no business to buy arms when there was rebellion in the land. He's rich, man, he's rich, and if you understand coining, you may know him into 500 or 1,000 gold pieces with the effigy of his blessed majesty upon them." The servant again came in, and whispered something over the back of the Lord Chief Justice's chair. Who? Exclaimed Jeffreys with a scowl. "Lord Woodall, my lord," replied the servant aloud. "Oh, ask him in, by all means," said the mayor. "On no account whatever," said Jeffreys, rising at once. "This is private business, and I fear me much that it is to move me against your request concerning that young man, Ralph. God help me, how we poor sinners are torn to pieces by opposite applications." "Attend to mercy, my lord, attend to mercy," said the mayor, but the judge was half-way down the room by this time. Jeffreys was learned in the art, in which statesmen of our own day are not unlearned, of making one favour serve 3 or 4 applicants. When Lord Woodall, therefore, urged his request that Ralph might be pardoned, Jeffreys made innumerable difficulties, and seemed at length to yield only at the old nobleman's most pressing entreaties. He insisted, at the same time, that Lord Woodall should undertake to express to the Attorney-General his full conviction that Ralph had no share in causing the death of his son, and request that he would enter a nolle prosequi when the case came again for trial. "There would be no pretence for pardoning him in this case," said Jeffreys, "if we were to have another trial next day, and hang him for murder. Waste of parchment, my lord, waste of parchment." Lord Woodall agreed to all that he demanded, and obtained in return a respite for Ralph before he left this admirable Lord Chief Justice. He went away with a heart wonderfully eased, 4.20 hours before, he could not have imagined that he should have felt anything like satisfaction at saving the life of Ralph Woodall, but now his feelings had taken a very different turn. Everybody says he did not do it, he thought. The Duke of Norfolk says it was impossible. This Lady Danvers, too, and the parson, all of them. I do not want to wrong an innocent man, but I will find out the murderer yet, and have vengeance upon him. Well, well, if Ralph is innocent, and I begin to fancy it may be so, he'll marry Lady Danvers, and Margaret will marry Robert, and we might all be happy again, but for the want of poor Henry. Poor old man, how completely he had forgotten, or how little he must have ever known, the feelings and passions of youth. The indifference of old age to those things of the heart which make the brightness of active existence is one of age's greatest evils, considered as a stage of mere mortal life, but is, perhaps, a good preparation for parting with mortal things to enter upon life eternal. Thus musing, as I have shown, Lord Woodall approached the door of the inn, over which a great lantern was burning. When his foot was upon the step, a man came out and was passing, but he suddenly stopped, gazed at the old lord, and exclaimed, "Ah, persecutor of my unhappy boy, is that you?" "Hush, man, hush!" cried Lord Woodall, grasping old Mr. Woodall's hand. "I have been in error. You are in error now. I am not persecuting your son. I have a respite for him in my pocket now, and the promise of a pardon." Old Mr. Woodall staggered back and would have fallen, but one of Lord Woodall's servants caught him and took him into the inn. An agitating scene followed, and Lord Woodall, who was by nature a good-hearted and kindly man, rejoiced greatly that the life of his own cousin's son was not to be sacrificed. A short time passed in loose and rambling questions and answers, and at length Mr. Woodall rose to go, saying, "I must see him, my lord, I must see him at once, for he must think that his father has forgotten him, and left him to his fate. I was detained upon the road by accident, but now, my lord, I may carry him good news, is it not so?" "You may assure him that he is safe," said the old nobleman. "Here, take the respite with you, man. That will be the best comfort you can give the boy." And taking it from his pocket, he put it in Mr. Woodall's hands. Engaging one of the horse-boys of the inn to guide him through the streets of a strange town, Ralph Woodall's father found his way to the jail, and rang the great bell which hung at the gate. A moment after, a little panel, just large enough to frame a man's head, was drawn back, and the face of a gaoler appeared behind an iron grating. "What do you want?" said the man. Mr. Woodall explained his business, and demanded to see his son. A rude and abrupt refusal was his only answer. He insisted, and demanded, at all events, to see the governor of the prison. The gaoler, however, said sullenly that the governor was absent, that the visitor was behind the hours, and that he should not have admission. Mr. Woodall then tried money, but, strange to say, even this proved in vain. The man refused it with real or affected indignation, and seemed about to close the wicket, when Ralph's father announced that he had a respite with him for the prisoner. "Then hand it in here," said the gaoler. "I suppose this means that he will be pardoned." "Undoubtedly," returned Mr. Woodall. "Therefore there can be no objection to my seeing him." "I won't break through the rules for anyone," said the gaoler doggedly. "The gaol is crammed full, and our orders are strict." Sad and disappointed, Mr. Woodall handed in the respite, calling up the boy who had accompanied him to witness its delivery, and desiring the gaoler to announce the good tidings he bore at once to his son. The man promised to do so, but the moment he had retired into his lodge near the gate, he threw the paper upon a shelf with a laugh, saying, "Well, lay thou there. Thou shan't stop me getting my £50. Devil take the judges, they won't let a poor man earn anything. They pocket it all themselves. I wonder how much this cost. A great deal more than I get, I dare say." His words may seem somewhat mysterious without explanation, which can only be given by entering one of the prison cells, and displaying what had been passing within about half an hour before. Ralph Woodall was sitting alone, about an hour before the judge had passed sentence upon him, with his limbs heavily fettered, and a still heavier weight upon his heart. Strong resolution had borne him through the terrible scenes which had lately passed, but all the bitterness of parting with life at the very period of early joy had been tasted in that last solitary hour. Suddenly the door opened, and a turnkey came in. He carried in his hand a small instrument, and closing the door carefully behind him, he put it in Ralph's hands, saying in a low tone, and pointing to the fetters, "Work away and get them off. Leave them and the saw behind you." Ralph gazed at him with astonishment, saying, "What do you mean?" "Haven't I told you?" said the turnkey. "Hark ye, at 1 a.m, be dressed and ready. However hard I lock that door just now, you will find it open then. Walk out, turn to the right along the passage, and you will come to a door. It will be open too. You will find a man beyond it, who won't see you. Don't you see him. Walk straight on till you find another man, who'll go on before you. Follow him as far as he goes. There you will find a horse and your people, and when they've paid the other 200, you can ride away." He waited for no reply, but turning away from the prisoner, quitted the cell, taking more than ordinary care in locking the door behind him, and making a good deal of noise about it. On the following day, at about 10 minutes before 10 o'clock, when a good deal of bustle and excitement was visible in the prison, in consequence of the preparations for bringing the prisoners for trial rapidly into the court, the deputy sheriff presented himself at the gate and demanded to see Mr. Ralph Woodall, announcing, with an important air, that a free pardon under the broad seal had been received by the high sheriff, and was then in his possession. "Quick work, Master Deputy," said the turnkey, who was standing beside the porter. "Condemned yesterday at 7, sentenced at 9, and pardoned this morning before 10. But come along, you'll like to give him the news yourself, I dare say, for you may get something for your pains. He doesn't want the stuff, and has been paid well enough, considering. We haven't been in this morning yet, for he said he'd like to sleep till 12, seeing he'd had a hard day's work of it yesterday." Thus saying, he led him away along the passages of the prison to one of the condemned cells. When he put the key in the door, however, it would not turn, and he exclaimed with a great oath, "Why, it's unlocked!" So it proved, and the cell empty. Nothing could exceed the horror and consternation expressed by the turnkey. He called the watchman who sat in the passage, and insinuated that he had unlocked the door and let the prisoner escape. The watchman repelled the charge with every appearance of indignation, asked how he could unlock the door when he hadn't the keys, and vowed he hadn't left the passage a minute, except when he went to call the doctor for John Phillips, who had fallen into a fit and was screaming like a madman. "Aye, he must have got out just then," said the turnkey. "How he picked the lock I don't know. I locked it fast enough last night, I'm sure." "I saw and heard you," said the watchman. "Aye, he's been well supplied from outside," said the turnkey, pointing to the fetters which lay upon the floor of the cell. "You see he has filed the irons right through." The sheriff's deputy was not altogether satisfied, however. The governor was called, a search was instituted, and a rope ladder was found thrown over the wall of the prison yard. As a pardon, however, had been received, the governor wisely thought that the less said about the matter the better, and the sheriff's deputy, who was his friend, agreed to take the same view of the case. Their plans were somewhat deranged, indeed, by the arrival of old Mr. Woodall in the midst of their consultations, but with great presence of mind, the deputy sheriff asserted boldly that the prisoner he inquired for had been set free upon pardon, and had departed more than an hour ago. End of chapter 42. Chapter 43 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43. On the night after Ralph Woodall's trial for treason, at the end of a lane, which at that time ran at the back of Dorchester jail, stood a man holding the bridles of 2 horses over his arm. From time to time he looked forward toward the prison, but more frequently kept his eyes fixed upon the ground. At length his sharp ear caught the sound of steps, and shortly after the figures of 2 men appeared advancing at a quick pace. The watcher did not move from the spot, but put his hand on the hilt of his sword and ascertained that it moved easily in the scabbard. The 2 men he had seen came forward rapidly, and when quite close one of them said, "Stilling?" in an inquiring tone. "The same, sir," said the man. "Here, fellow, here are the other £200 for you. Look at it and count it, if you will." The third man took a bag which was held out to him, withdrew the shade of a dark lantern, and by its light examined what he had received. He soon saw that the contents of the bag were gold, and after weighing it in his hand, seemed to be satisfied that the count must be about right. "I dare say it's all fair," he said, "but I cannot stop to count it. Good night, sir, and good speed to you. You'll be far enough by this time tomorrow, I hope." "That he will," answered Stilling, and drawing one of the horses forward, while the gaoler closed his dark lantern and hurried rapidly away, he continued, "Let us mount and be gone, sir. We ought to be 10 leagues at sea before daybreak." Ralph sprang upon the horse's back, and in a few moments he and Gaunt Stilling were riding away from Dorchester at full speed. The latter led the way, and very little was said by either for somewhat more than an hour and a half, when Stilling turned to his young master, saying, "We are beyond pursuit, I think, sir. 20 minutes more will bring us to the boat's side. All is ready and arranged, and they but wait for us to put off." "I have much to thank you for, Stilling," replied his master, "but you must have had some assistance from others. Who has furnished you with the means to bribe these men?" "Faith, no one furnished me with anything for that purpose," replied Stilling, "but Lady Danvers's steward gave me £500 to make all smooth at Bridgewater when we were going there. I had no scruple in using it now, as I knew she would wish it used, so I paid these knaves £350 to let you out, and hired a good lugger for another 100. New questions and answers succeeded, and Ralph found that the cause of Stilling's never having returned to the farmhouse at the edge of Sedgemoor, when sent to obtain information, was very simple. He had fallen in with some men of the Tangier regiment, and had been carried to the quarters of Colonel Kirke. That worthy officer had thought fit to detain him, strongly suspecting that he had some design of joining the forces of Monmouth. "I do not mean to say," continued Stilling, "that I had not a strong inclination to do so, for there was one good stroke I would fain have given in that battle. However, Kirke could prove nothing against me, except that I had made my way straight to the quarters of the king's army, which didn't suit his purpose. Otherwise he would have had as much pleasure in hanging his old comrade as any of the poor rebels whom he butchered. He was forced in the end to let me go, and the first thing I heard was that you were in Dorchester jail. I took what measures I thought necessary regarding the first charge against you, but I was quite unprepared for the second, and marvellous well they got it up, so I had nothing for it but to do my best to get you out after condemnation, which, knowing well all the people here in Dorchester, was no very difficult matter." Less than half an hour more brought the 2 horsemen to the seashore, at a spot where the coast was low and sandy, and after riding along for some way they came upon a small group of fishermen's houses, where lights were still to be seen, and several persons moving about. At some little distance from the shore was a large lug sailboat of some 40 or 50 tons burden, and Ralph and his companion were instantly accosted by 1 or 2 of the fishermen, who urged them to hurry their movements as the tide was going out. Neither was inclined to make any long delay. Ralph sprang to the ground at once. Stilling gave the horses to one of the men, with injunctions to do with them as they had been directed before, and both entering a little rowboat which lay at the beach, were pushed off by 2 of the fishermen who accompanied them, and were soon safely on board the lugger. A favourable breeze was blowing, the large heavy sails were speedily filled, and away the boat went, bounding over the waves, directing her course right toward the coast of France. It might render the narrative more interesting, perhaps, if I could recall any hair-breadth escapes or marvellous passages in the voyage, but alas, there were none such to chronicle. The wind was perfectly fair, the water slightly agitated but not stormy. No king's vessel appeared to give chase to the little craft, and the only objects they saw, except sea and sky, until they reached the French coast, were several other large fishing boats like their own, and just about daybreak, 1 man-of-war in the far distance, with all sails set, but steering away from them. She looked like a phantom upon the waters, with her hull below the line of vision, and her sails figured faintly on the distant sky. Toward the close of the day they reached the little French port, and doubtless it would not be very interesting to the reader to hear all the little difficulties that beset them in making their way to Holland, or how they overcame them. Suffice that they were overcome, and that Ralph and his companion crossed the frontier line in about a fortnight after they had quitted England. They made their way as rapidly as possible to Amsterdam, the Hague not being a place quite safe at that time for refugees from England. Having passed all his early life at college or in the country, Ralph Woodall only found 1 person in the city with whom he had any acquaintance. This was a dry, melancholy young man, who had been at Cambridge with him for some time, but had abandoned the Church of England and adopted the views of the most extreme Calvinists. He was kind in his own way, and Ralph was in need of kindness, but the views of this fellow collegian were so different from his own that there could be no great companionship between them, and certainly the young dissenter's conversation was not at all likely to lighten the load of care for any man. Gaunt Stilling, on the contrary, found numerous acquaintances among the English who had taken refuge in Amsterdam, but both Gaunt Stilling and his master had too many dark and gloomy chambers in the palace of the Brest to be willing to admit many to their intimacy. Ralph Woodall, on his arrival at the Dutch capital, it must be recollected, was in no degree aware that a pardon had been obtained for him in regard to the crime of high treason with which he had been charged, nor did he know that Lord Woodall, satisfied with his innocence, had ceased to pursue him for the murder of his son. Condemned for the offence which he had never committed, liable to be tried the moment he returned for another of which he was equally innocent, and moreover charged with a third, which was little less heinous in the eyes of the court than murder or treason, he saw nothing before him but a long and hopeless exile, the loss of all bright prospects, and the vanishing of all his dreams of love. At the same time, gnawing care preyed upon him. It may easily be supposed that he carried no great sum of money with him. Almost all he possessed had been expended in the prison. The £50 which remained in Gaunt Stilling's hands from the money given by Lady Danvers was nearly exhausted, and coming want stared him in the face. Many an anxious consultation did he hold with Gaunt Stilling as to what was to be done in the circumstances in which they were placed, and but little comfort did he get from the servant, of a kind that could still be at all available. Stilling's reply always was, "Oh, you will have money soon, sir, from England, and so shall I. I have taken care to let the people know where we are, and they won't leave us destitute. Your father will take care of you, and I have friends who will look out for me." "But I cannot and will not bear to be a burden upon my father," replied Ralph. "I must seek out some employment here, in the service of the state as a soldier, or in any other capacity for which I may be suited. Methinks I will go to the Hague and see the Prince of Orange. I can show him that I have had no share in this mad insurrection of Monmouth's, and prove my innocence pretty well of all other crime. I have letters also for several gentlemen at the Hague from the Duke of Norfolk, and doubtless they will use their influence to obtain for me some employment." "Wait a little, sir, wait a little," was Gaunt Stilling's reply. "We shall hear something from England soon. There is news that must be sent to me, and that speedily. In the letter that brings them we shall most likely hear more of those in whom you take an interest." He was not wrong in his anticipations. 10 days had hardly passed when several letters reached Amsterdam for Ralph, and 2 for Gaunt Stilling. Ralph's intelligence was joyful on all points but one. The letters conveyed to him information that a full pardon had been obtained for him on the charge of treason, that a nolle prosequi had been entered by the Attorney General in regard to the charge for murder, and that Lord Woodall was fully convinced, from evidence that had been laid before him, of his innocence of the death of Henry Woodall. But it seemed, from the tenor of all the letters, that a charge still hung over his head of having comforted and assisted a nonconformist clergyman, and attended a dissenting conventicle, which might subject him, if he returned unadvisedly, to lengthened imprisonment. Several passages in these letters were somewhat obscure, for his father, by whom one was written, did not seem to be aware that he had made his escape without any knowledge of the pardon, and Hortensia, who wrote to him likewise, though she appeared to have comprehended at once how his flight to Holland had been effected, alluded to the painful and unhappy circumstances in which he was placed, in terms which he thought hardly applicable to the mere chance of his being tried for a very inferior offence. A third letter, which surprised him much, was from his cousin Lord Coldenham. It was written in a frank but not cheerful vein, congratulating him on his escape from death, but urging him strongly to return to England immediately. It assigned no motives on the part of the young lord himself for pressing this point so strongly, but the concluding words of the letter were, "For the sake of your own best interests, Ralph, for the sake of your dearest hopes, come, and come directly." The effect of the intelligence he received upon his mind was to render him thoughtful but not sad, and he was still hesitating in some degree how he should act, for his father's letter contained a remittance which enabled him to act freely, when Gaunt Stilling joined him with an expression of countenance which puzzled the young gentleman a good deal. His brow was contracted with a heavy frown, but his eyes were bright and sparkling, and there was a quivering sort of eagerness about his lip at every word he spoke, which betrayed no inconsiderable agitation within. "Well, sir, what news?" he said abruptly. Ralph gave him a summary of the intelligence he had received, and the man laughed rather wildly, saying, "Ah, is that all? Better news than mine." "I am sorry to hear that you have had bad tidings," replied Ralph. "I hope they are not of a very serious character." Family matters," answered Gaunt Stilling, walking twice up and down the room. "The old man is ill, and well he may be. A bad complaint, sir. A broken heart." "I have just been pondering, Stilling," said Ralph, "whether it would be better or not for me to return to England at once. My cousin, Lord Coldenham, urges me strongly to do so, and if I can we can go together." "Let me go first, sir," said Gaunt Stilling, quickly and eagerly. "You shall soon hear more from me, or of me, more than all the rest have told you, I'll answer for it. As for myself, I must go, and this very day. See what there is written to me." And he put in Ralph's hand a letter containing the following few words: "Come back instantly. You are wanted here at once, for the great work which must be done at length. I have refrained too long. I will hesitate no longer. Mortimer." "This is strange," said Ralph, returning the letter. "Not so strange as some tidings in this letter, sir," said Gaunt Stilling, striking lightly the other he held in his hand. "However, before I go, let me ask you one question, sir, which is of more importance than you may think. I am very bold, but you will pardon me. Are you to be married, as men say, to Lady Danvers?" "Not the most remote chance of it," said Ralph. "Have you, too, Stilling, been deceived by appearances, the deceitfulness of which none could judge better? Neither Lady Danvers nor myself ever dreamed of such a thing. She knows my heart too well, Stilling." "Thank you, sir, thank you," said Gaunt Stilling warmly. "And now, good-bye." "But is there such great haste?" said Ralph. "I would fain have an hour or two's time for consideration as to whether I had better accompany you or not." "Better stay where you are, sir," replied Stilling, "for the present at least. I would not stop 1 hour after having received this letter for more than King James could give. I owe this man, sir, a deep debt of gratitude, which must be paid in whatever way he chooses." "Besides," added Ralph, "I am deeply your debtor, Stilling, and would fain do something, however little is in my power." "Never mind that, sir," said Stilling, slowly inclining his head with a very significant gesture. "All debts, to me and from me, will soon be paid. Fare you well, sir. May God speed you better when I have gone from you than you have sped while I have been with you." And without further leave-taking, he turned and quitted the room. There was something very remarkable in his manner, a sort of sharp, wild abruptness, which, in all the variations of his mood, and they had been many, Ralph had never remarked before. He mused over the matter for a moment or two, but we are too apt to look upon the signs of suppressed passion in others as matters of no moment, not seeming to comprehend that where emotion is so strong as to carry with it a sense of the necessity of concealing it, the very temporary resistance with which it meets only seems to concentrate its power, and it bursts forth at length in act because it was denied expression in words. After thinking over the character and conduct of Gaunt Stilling for a few minutes in silence, Ralph dismissed the subject from his mind and returned to other thoughts. He wrote to his father, to Hortensia, and to Margaret, without much hope indeed of finding an opportunity to forward the letter to her in safety and with secrecy. He wrote, too, to Lord Woodall, repeating his assurance that he had never drawn his sword against his cousin Henry, and buoying himself up with false and flattering hopes that Margaret might still be his. To Hortensia and his father he judged it necessary, from the ambiguous expression in their letters, to give a detailed account of his escape as far as it could be done, without committing any of the persons engaged in it, and assuring them both that he had never heard of the pardon till the morning on which he wrote. Lord Coldenham's letter he reserved for further consideration, and a gleam of peaceful hope seemed to break upon him once more, after so many had passed away, overshadowed as soon as seen. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44. Ormbar Castle presented a gay and festive scene, such as had not been beheld within its walls since the time of the first Charles. A number of the neighbouring nobility and gentry had been invited to pass a few days there, in a sport already beginning to fall into disuse, although it had been revived for a short time by the favour of Charles II. A mew had long been attached to the castle, and the hawks of Ormbar were famous throughout the country. The merry monarch himself had even considered the present of a couple of pair of well-reclaimed birds of that breed as a great gift, and a grand hawking party at Ormbar was sure to attract all that was gay and graceful in the county. Two facts were remarked as strange by the guests: that the young Lord Coldenham was not present at the castle, for which various unsatisfactory reasons were assigned, and that Margaret Woodall, publicly announced as the affianced bride of her cousin Robert, though in the castle with her father, and appearing occasionally at meal-time in the hall, shared not in any of the sports or amusements which were going on, and when seen came with a pale cheek and a sorrowful brow, self-involved in her own thoughts, and smiling not at the gayest jests or most pleasant amusements. She seemed to take no interest in anything. She hardly appeared to notice aught around her. She looked like a person walking in a dream, and that a sad one, and vain was every effort to call her attention or to awaken her interest. Lady Coldenham for several days seemed to take no heed of this conduct, let it pass as if it were undeserving a thought, but at length one day, as Margaret sat alone in her room, the imperious woman entered and seated herself with an air of proud disdain. "I come," she said, "to inquire what you mean, my pretty cousin, by your treatment of my son." "Me, madam," said Margaret, gazing at her with a look of abhorrence, "I have no particular meaning in my conduct." "Then I wish you would have," replied Lady Coldenham bitterly, "and a very different meaning from that which every one puts upon your demeanour. I wish you would mean to please your promised husband, to show him some sort of courtesy, if not respect." Margaret was roused. "Respect!" she said. "What should I respect in Robert Woodall?" "You should respect him whom you have promised to marry," said Lady Coldenham. "You should respect the house from which he springs." "My promise to marry him," replied Margaret with cold calmness, "was cruelly wrung from me in a moment of the greatest agony. It is sufficient that I keep it, without exacting more. He could not make me more than his slave. Knowing that I abhorred him, he persisted in a suit which he ought to have felt could only make me abhor him more. Obtained from my poor father, by what means I know not, a solemn promise that I should be his, instigated my father to take advantage of the most terrible circumstances to obtain a pledge from me. And now, Lady Coldenham, my father will redeem his vow. I will redeem my pledge. My hand shall be his. The estates, which he covets more than my hand, will be his likewise, but ask nothing further. My heart can never be his. My esteem, my respect, my love, he can never obtain." "Impudent girl!" exclaimed Lady Coldenham. "This to his mother?" "Ay, to anyone, to everyone, to all who question me on the subject," answered Margaret. "I am no longer the timid child whom you once knew, to quail at your presence, and to shrink from your proud eye. You and yours have taken from me all hope and all fear. You have strengthened me by misery. You have made my life valueless. Death a blessing to be coveted, and not far off, I trust. My father has brought me here, Lady Coldenham, against my will, but I trust at least that the privacy of my own chamber will be allowed to me." "Good, mighty good!" cried Lady Coldenham with a scornful laugh. "Now mark me, Mistress Margaret Woodall, we will tame you a little. You seek, I know, to put off this marriage till the latest possible hour, but as we find that kindness has no effect upon you, we will try sterner measures. We will not allow you to trifle with us. The marriage shall take place soon, immediately." "That will be as my father shall decide," replied Margaret in as calm a tone as before. "I have always held that a man, doomed to die, shows himself a coward if he attempts to put off his execution for a moment. You have made me brave, Lady Coldenham. You cannot frighten me." "Ha, ha," said the old lady, rising with an air of triumph. "Lucky that no compulsion will be needed," and she passed majestically out of the room. Well might she triumph, for the object of her visit to Margaret was attained with less difficulty than she had expected. No opposition had been shown to a speedy marriage, and she hastened to Lord Woodall to tell him that his daughter consented. The old man could hardly believe his ears, but the assurance of Lady Coldenham was strong, and she told him, with a slight gloss, what had passed between her and Margaret. Robert Woodall came to her aid, seeming to understand his mother's schemes almost by intuition. Between them both, they soon obtained Lord Woodall's consent that a very early day should be fixed, and preparations were immediately begun. Margaret bore up well when the public eye was upon her. She quailed not, she wavered not, no tear was seen to dim her eyelids, not a word of opposition did she utter. Her character seemed to be entirely changed. The frank, simple, timid girl, blooming in rich health, and agitated by manifold emotions, was now the cold, grey, firm, decided woman, pale as monumental marble, and unmoved by any of the passing things of life. A petrifying hand had touched her, that of despair, and she was indeed no longer the same. Robert Woodall saw it all, understood it all, but he had no pity, he rejoiced. Margaret was more alone than ever. She seldom, when she could avoid it, quitted her own room. She left to others all preparations, and only stipulated that the marriage should be performed by the good Irish clergyman who had been for so many years her father's chaplain, who had known her mother, and been the friend of her childhood. She knew that he had many faults, but she knew that he had many virtues too, and she thought that his familiar face would be a comfort and a support to her. She was sitting alone one day in a little chamber communicating with her bedroom, while all the family and guests were absent on some gay occasion at Dorchester, when her maid announced to her that Dr. Maffili had come to visit her. bring him hither," cried Margaret, with the first appearance of eagerness she had displayed for many a day. "Here we shall not be interrupted, and I want much to speak with him." In 2 minutes more, Dr. Maffili, with his portly person and buoyant step, swung into the room, and taking her hands in his, exclaimed, "Ah, my dear child, my dear young lady, that is. I am glad to see you again, but not to see you looking so. Bother it, Mistress Margaret, they have worried all the colour out of your cheeks. They used to bloom like a couple of roses on a summer's day, but now they are like lilies in the shade. Well, man's a curious beast. I would not have had a hand in withering those roses to be Archbishop of Canterbury." "The stem on which they grew will soon wither too," said Margaret sadly. "The tree is dead at the heart, doctor, and can never bloom again." "Don't say that, Mistress Margaret, don't say that, my dear child," cried the good parson. "That's just what I came to see you about, with just the least possible hope that one way or another, what between representations and denunciations, oh, that I were but a Roman Catholic and believed in transubstantiation, wouldn't I curse them from the altar and put a great seal upon them? But, as I was saying, I do think something might be done, though what the foul fiend, the man, intends to do, I don't know, for your father seems to me like a rock, and as to Robert Woodall, he's mischief itself, and the more he thinks he vexes you, the more he'll do it. Couldn't you get up early one moonlight morning, my darling, and just make a run for it? There's a young man on the other side of the water who will be glad enough to hold you to his heart, and I'll go over and marry you to prevent mischief." "Hush, hush, hush," cried Margaret, clasping her hands wildly. "Oh, forbear, my good friend. No," she continued, "my father has called down the curse of God upon his head if he does not give me to Robert Woodall. I have consented in order to save poor Ralph's life, and I will be honest. I will keep my word, though it kill me." "Ay, but wasn't that word cheated out of you, my darling?" said the parson earnestly. "Did they not persuade you that poor Ralph had killed your brother Harry? If they did, I can show you in this paper here that it was one of the biggest lies that ever was told. I may show you the paper, dear Mistress Margaret, for though it was given to me in confidence, sub sigillo confessionis, as I should say if I were a Romanist, God help the benighted people and the king at the back of them, I was permitted by the letter to bring it forward if they tried Ralph for the murder, and to show it to you, if need be. Now I say I can prove from this—" No need, replied Margaret, laying her hand upon his arm. "There is only one thing you can do for me, and that I wish you much to do. I have never been deceived in regard to Ralph's innocence of my brother's death. I have always done him justice, but I want you to tell him, Dr. Maffili, I want you to tell him hereafter," and the tears rolled plentifully down her face, "that Margaret loved him to the last hour she was permitted to love anyone on earth. At the altar I renounce all earthly love. The ceremony might as well be my funeral as my marriage, for it consigns my heart to the tomb, and leaves my spirit only to seek its Maker. Thank God I have wept again. I believe these tears will save my reason." The good clergyman wept too, wept like a child, but in the midst of his tears he kept feeling in his pocket till he brought forth an unsealed letter, from the midst of which he took out another paper. "But what answer do you mean to give to this man?" he asked, totally forgetting that poor Margaret knew not who the man was. "He's a strange creature, and deals with the devil, I've little doubt. I spent a couple of hours with him one day, and he told me all manner of things. A learned man, too. I was his match in Latin, but he beat me to mud in Greek, and as to Hebrew and Arabic, Lord have mercy upon us." Who? cried Margaret. "Do you mean Mortimer?" "Oh, ay, just Mortimer," answered the parson. "Mortimer's his surname, and Devil, I suppose, is his Christian name, though not a very Christian name either. But here, see what he writes to you here, for I take it for granted it's intended for you, because he told me to give it to you." And he spread out the inner paper before Margaret's eyes. "Misguided girl," the paper ran, "you have nearly destroyed your own happiness for ever, for want of truth and confidence. Did I not tell you to be true and faithful to the last, and your happiness would be secure? Write me down an answer to these questions. Do you still love him whom you loved first? Has your heart never swerved from him through vanity, lightness, or caprice? Was it solely to save his life that you consented to wed a man whom, if there be any honesty in the heart of woman, you are bound to hate? Answer at once, and answer truly." "Here's a pen and ink, darling," said Dr. Maffili, bringing the implements for writing from a distant table. "I'll take it upon me that you can answer all the questions handsomely enough, and the man says something about a hope in his letter to me, though how the devil he found me out, or his little spalpeen of a boy in blue and silver either, I can't tell. He can't have an optic glass that would look all the way from Lincolnshire to Cerne Abbas, to say nothing of the corners it would have to look round." "I will answer truly at all events," replied Margaret, "be there hope or no hope," and taking the pen she wrote rapidly, "I love him ever. No feeling of my heart has ever swerved from him. It was solely to save his life that I consented to wed a man whom I do hate. That is all true, so help me heaven at my utmost need." "There, Dr. Maffili," she said, "give him that, but it is all in vain. You know the marriage is appointed for next Friday." "Friday?" said the doctor. "That's an unlucky day, my dear. I never knew anyone married on Friday in all my life." "There never before was such a bridal," said Margaret. "Unlucky? Oh, Dr. Maffili, if they chose the most unlucky day in all the calendar, they had hardly found one black enough to fit my wedding. I will not be married in mourning," she said, "for it would grieve my father, but I will have no bridal finery. I will not affect to rejoice while my heart is dying." "Well, I think it would have been but civil," said the doctor, "to have let me know about the Friday." "Doubtless you will hear of it to-day," replied Margaret. "Originally the day was fixed for the Monday after, but something seems to have affected Lady Coldham strangely, and she has urged my father to curtail even the short space allowed. To me it is indifferent what is the day of execution. Doubtless Jane Grey shrunk from the block and axe, as I shrink from the altar and the ring. But she met her fate firmly, and so will I. Hark! There is a halloo in the fields. They are coming back. Take the paper, but I say I have no hope, that my fate is sealed. Remember to tell Ralph what I have said, and bid him think of me as one dead, for to everything that makes existence life, I must be dead from the moment the ring is put upon my finger." After a few words more, Dr. Maffili left her, and in less than a quarter of an hour the house, so lately silent and solitary, was full of gay sounds and heedless laughter, jarring painfully with the thoughts of the melancholy tenant of that solitary room. Indeed, it seemed as if the whole party, with the exception of Lord Woodall, had determined to leave the poor girl to her own imaginations. No one came to console her or support her, no one even attempted to cheer her by conversation, or to withdraw her from her sad and lonely state. Her father did come to see her and strove to speak cheerfully, but there was a silent reproach in his daughter's deep gloom which sent him ever away with a heart depressed, and a consciousness that he had destroyed the peace of his only remaining child. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times, by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. There were horses and carriages at the door of Ormbar Castle. The courtyard was crowded with servants in all kinds of livery. Lady Coldnam had resolved that the marriage should not want witnesses, and every one of noble blood in the county had been invited. One or two, who had been there the preceding week, asked as they arrived whether Lord Coldnam had returned, and though the answer was no, they did not much marvel, for Lady Coldnam was so completely monarch in her own family that no one could expect she would make any alteration in her arrangements for the pleasure or convenience of a son. The great hall was thrown open on that inauspicious morning, and richly decorated with evergreens and the few flowers which still lingered after the year's brighter part had passed away. Not less than 40 or 50 people were assembled in that hall, but none of the family yet appeared among them, with the exception of Robert Woodall, who had entered the room, remained for a few minutes, and retired again, explaining that some deeds and other writings had to be signed in the small room hard by, where Lady Coldnam usually received her guests. It is to that room which we must, in the first place, turn our eyes, before we relate what occurred afterward in the hall when the party was setting out for the wedding. It was a handsome and beautifully decorated chamber, nearly square, with a high ornamented ceiling of black oak. It was called in those days the little withdrawing room, but it was at least 30 feet in length, and 7 or 8 and 20 in width. A large table was placed in the middle of the room, and at it was seated old Lady Coldnam in a large armchair. She was richly attired, and looked in her stern dignity like a queen upon her throne. She had become awfully pale, however, during the last few weeks. The delicate blending of colour in her cheek was gone, and the flesh looked not like marble, but wax. Old Lord Woodall was seated near, with a nervous, anxious, apprehensive expression of countenance. 2 or 3 lawyers were further down the table, with a number of parchments before them. Robert Woodall and 2 of his gay friends, somewhat older than himself, loose, debauched men, with that weak, supercilious expression of countenance which almost always gathers upon the face after a life of promiscuous licentiousness, stood at a little distance from the table on Lord Woodall's right, while Margaret appeared behind, near a window, leaning heavily on the arm of Hortensia Danvers, the only bridesmaid she had chosen, and whom she had persisted in choosing, notwithstanding a cold sneer from Lady Coldnam, and some opposition on the part of the poor girl's father. Hortensia was in a blaze of beauty and magnificently attired. Her bright eyes were flashing with light, her brow slightly contracted, her beautifully chiselled nostrils expanding like those of a proud horse, and her fine arching lip quivering with feelings of indignation that hardly could be repressed. Her arm passed across her waist, and her hand rested upon poor Margaret's as she leaned upon her, with a fond and comforting pressure. But her eyes were turned forward toward Lord Woodall and Lady Coldnam, and seemed to express wonder as well as disgust. Behind her and Margaret stood their 2 maids, and the faithful old attendant of the unhappy bride often put her handkerchief to her eyes, which bore marks of many tears. Some conversation took place between the persons seated at the table regarding the contents of the documents before them. There were some points which Lord Woodall seemed not to comprehend easily, and which the lawyers did not explain clearly. At length, however, after some minutes had passed in question and answer, the old lord seemed to grow impatient. "Well, give me the pen," he cried. "It does not much matter. I dare say it is all right." And in a bold, dashing manner, which hardly covered the trembling of his hand, he wrote the word Woodall. "Now, my ladies," said one of the lawyers, addressing Lady Coldnam, "you will have the goodness to sign this paper, and your son will sign below." A slight shade of hesitation seemed to pass across Lady Coldnam's face, and though she took the pen and dipped it in the ink, she held it suspended for a moment ere she wrote her name. The noise, perhaps, of the opening door, which was a little behind her on the left, hurried the act, and the paper was signed. Robert Woodall had already advanced to write his name after his mother's, and had received the pen from Lady Coldenham's hand. But at that moment Lord Coldenham himself came forward and put his brother aside, saying, "Stop a moment, sir." His tone was so stern and decided that Robert drew back, and Lady Coldenham fixed her eyes upon her eldest son with an expression of fierce but yet apprehensive inquiry, as one may see a chained eagle, when menaced by a child's cane, gaze at him, ready to strike, yet watchful for the blow. "Nonsense, Coldenham, no trash just now," cried Robert Woodall, with an affected laugh. "Trash, sir?" said Lord Coldenham, in a stern and bitter tone, which he had never assumed in his life before. "Do you suppose that I would jest even at a moment like this? I ask you, madam," he continued, turning to his mother, "is this to go on? There stands a poor girl, driven by hard usage to marry a man whom she detests. This marriage has been hurried rapidly forward for fear of the appearance of certain unpleasant impediments. Though I wrote from a distant part of the country, it would seem either that it was not understood how much I knew, or that it was believed I could not get here in time, or that I was supposed to be so base and mean as to conceal facts detrimental to myself, which could be beneficial to others. I am here, madam. Those who have so judged me are mistaken. I ask you again, is this to go on?" "Yes," said Lady Coldenham between her closed teeth, grasping tightly the arm of her chair. "Yes, serpent." "It shall go on, so help me heaven," cried Lord Woodall. "I have pledged my honour and my word, and no power on earth can shake me. She shall be his if I live 3 hours longer. I will not live perjured and forsworn." "Yes, generous brother," said Robert Woodall, "it shall go on. That I will maintain with my voice and with my sword." "Your sword," said Lord Coldenham, with a bitter sneer. "Those who rest upon that had better ask Sedgemoor of its glory. But tell me, sir, what name are you going to sign to that paper?" "My own, of course," replied the young man. "And what is your own?" asked his brother. "Forbear, forbear!" shrieked Lady Coldenham. "Forbear! Have you forborne?" said her son sternly, and then, turning to Margaret, he took her hand kindly, saying, "Margaret, my dear cousin, I ask you, shall this go on? I tell you, you are in no degree bound to that young man, that he is not what he seems, that he stands before you there, a lie. Speak one word, and I will end it all. I tell you, you are not bound to him." "I am bound by my promise to my father," replied Margaret in a low, still, solemn voice. Lord Woodall's face had been becoming redder and more red, and as his daughter answered, he exclaimed, "And I say she shall marry him, be he who or what he may," and he added a fearful oath. "Well then, without there," cried Lord Coldenham, raising his voice high, and the door was immediately partly opened. "You cannot go in there, sir," said a voice in quick accents without. "We are ordered to keep every one out but the family." "Out of my way, knaves," said a loud, rich, powerful voice, which echoed round and round the room. "Learn that I am master here," and at the same moment the door flew wide open, and 2 of Lady Coldenham's servants were cast headlong into the room. Following them, with a firm, calm step, and a brow stern and gloomy, came a man of some 60 years of age, above the ordinary height, powerful in frame and dignified in carriage. He was richly, though somewhat darkly, attired, and in his hand he carried a large roll of paper. All eyes turned in that direction, and Lady Coldenham's with the rest. She uttered no word, no scream, but a low groan escaped her, and her eyes closed. A multitude of questions were asked, and sudden exclamations uttered. "Why, that is the old man we saw in Lincolnshire," cried Robert Woodall. "God bless my life! Why, I recollect you quite well, Sir Robert," said one of the old lawyers sitting at the table. "Who are you, sir?" demanded Lord Woodall, almost fiercely. "That woman's husband," replied Mortimer, pointing to Lady Coldenham. "Otherwise Sir Robert Hardwicke of Ormbar Castle. Take her away. She has fainted, as well she may, at the sight of one who has forborne too long." "But you were supposed dead," said the lawyer who had before spoken. "She married under a false impression. She thought you had been killed by the Moors on the coast of Africa." "She knew that I was a slave of the Moors," replied Sir Robert Hardwicke, "and she amused me with hopes of ransom for 3 long years after she had married Lord Coldham, as these loving letters will testify. Then indeed she thought me dead, for I discovered the fraud, and suffered the tale of my death in captivity to go forth." "Then I am Lord Coldham," exclaimed Robert with a disgusting laugh of exultation, "for I was born more than 4 years after my mother's marriage." "Not so," replied Sir Robert Hardwicke, seating himself in the chair from which Lady Coldham had just been removed. "Your mother's marriage was a fraud, and as such invalid altogether." "We will have proof of that," said Robert Woodall. "Were these letters not proof?" answered the others gravely. "The fact of her having a monument erected to a man whom she knew to be living, and having buried therein a wooden figure, pretending it to be a corpse brought from beyond sea, would, methinks, be sufficient. I tell you, sir, and I tell all, that you are simply Robert Ratcliffe, the natural son of Catherine Ratcliffe, Lady Hardwicke, by the Earl of Coldham. Now let us see whether Lord Woodall will marry his only child to you or not." "He promised her to me without reservation," cried Robert vehemently. "He did it for services I performed to him, unconnected with my birth. He took God to witness. He pledged his honour and his faith." "And I will keep them sacredly," cried Lord Woodall, after an instant's hesitation. "Margaret, there stands your husband. Let us end this scene. The clergyman is waiting. The guests are all prepared. Shuffle those parchments to the dogs. My heiress can build up a new family. It was not his fault if his mother played the fool." Margaret pressed her hand upon her brow, for a momentary hope had risen up in her breast, but to be extinguished. Lord Woodall, however, grasped her arm, saying, "Come on." "Leave her with me, my lord," said Hortensia sadly. "You go on with him. We will follow." "Come on then, Robert," said the old lord, taking the young man's arm. "Sir Robert Hardwicke will leave you and your wife's eldest son to finish as you please the fine scene you have arranged this day. This one, at least, I will take care of." "So be it," said Mortimer, "but methinks in courtesy I must grace the wedding, seeing it is so joyful a one. Lead on, my lord, and if the bride comes living from the altar, we will still feast the gay company here, in this place, where one happy marriage was celebrated some 30 years ago. Lead on, my lord, I say." "I will so," replied Lord Woodall sharply. "Come, Margaret, follow close behind." Thus saying, he walked on with Robert Woodall, throwing wide the door which led into the great hall beyond. Margaret followed with a faint step, and a hand which Hortensia felt trembling on her arm. Lady Danvers whispered to her eagerly, and her last words were, "At the altar, at the very altar. He has no claim. Your promise is not to him. You promised to wed Robert Woodall, not this man." But still Margaret moved on. The gay company in the hall separated, making a sort of lane as the bridal party passed, and several voices said, "Health and happiness to the bride and bridegroom." But the cheek of Robert Woodall, which had been flushed with excitement, turned deadly pale a moment or two after he had entered the hall. What was it produced the change, and why did his eyes stare so fixedly forward? There was nothing in the way to the hall door but an old man and a young one, but that young man was taking a step forward, and the old one tried to hold him back in vain. "Robert Ratcliffe, you are a knave, a liar, a villain, a cheat, a traitor," said Gaunt Stilling, approaching close to him and striking him a blow. The ladies scattered back in terror, the gentleman gazed in surprise without interfering, and Robert, after an instant's hesitation, laid his hand upon his sword and drew it. The moment it was done, Gaunt Stilling's sword was crossed with his blade. Lord Woodall and Robert's brother beat up the weapons ere 2 passes had been exchanged, but as they did so, Robert Woodall fell back upon the pavement, and then Gaunt Stilling thrust his sword into the sheath, and dropped his hands by his side, for anyone to take him who would. The confusion that succeeded was indescribable. Some rushed round the fallen man and raised him up, gazing on his face, or striving to staunch the bleeding of a small wound on the right side, which would have seemed of no great importance had not the torrent of gore which poured from it told how deep the avenging blade had gone. Those who gazed upon his face soon saw the attempt to keep in the flood of life was vain. The unhappy man's eyes rolled in his head, but they were meaningless, lifeless. Their motion was merely convulsive, as probably were also the gasping efforts he made as if to speak. Others rushed upon his slayer and seized him roughly, while Stillings's father approached slowly and exclaimed, "Oh, my son, what have you done?" To the latter he answered sternly, "Avenged my sister, old man, avenged her whom he deceived, and wronged, and killed by falsehood. The serpent, whom your weak compliance with his mother's fraud warmed into venomous power, stung your own child to the death, and your other child has crushed him." Then, turning sharply upon those who had laid hands upon him, he shook them off, saying, "What need to seize a man who seeks not to escape, who is neither ashamed of the deed he has done, nor afraid of its consequences? Stand back and let me look upon the villain." And striding forward, he gazed upon the face of Robert Woodall, while the dead man's brother supported the flaccid form partly on his knee, and Sir Robert Hardwicke held his hand upon the pulse. "Ay, young rebel," said Gaunt Stilling, looking sternly in his face, "I warned thee, but thou wouldst not be warned. Thou hadst timely notice to forbear. Thou hadst timely notice to keep thy word with my poor Kate. But thou must wed a great lady, must thou? Thou must have the broad lands of Woodall. Thou must leave Kate Stilling to die of grief and shame, after having poisoned her mind against her father and brother. But I warned thee long ago, and thou didst contrive too to make me take the life of thy noble cousin, believing that one who bore the name of Woodall was bold enough to fight his rival manfully, and not to put the peril upon another. That is the only thing I regret in life. You stare," he continued sharply, turning to one of the guests. "Do you suppose that, standing here and seeing him be there, a piece of carrion, with his soul fresh flown to another world, whither I must soon follow to stand before the same judgment seat, that I feel the least regret, remorse, or shame for having sent him thither? No, man, no. I am proud of the deed. Society is my debtor. God has taken vengeance by my hand, and only timely did it come. Look at that lady there," and he pointed to Margaret, who stood trembling like an aspen leaf hard by, trapped to his snares by the most deceitful artifices, loathing him, yet bound to him by lie-obtained promises, on the point of sacrificing happiness and life itself rather than break her plighted word. "Look at that old man," and he pointed to Lord Woodall, whose heart would have been one everlasting curse, a core of fire in his bosom, if he had been suffered to drag his daughter to the altar to unite her fate to that reprobate. These I have saved by that one blow, but not only these. All you around me owe me much. From such a pitiful villain as this, from such a dark and secret plotter, who did his blackest deeds by other men's hands, no heart is safe, no home is sacred. Hark you, Robert Ratcliffe, I come after you very speedily. Prepare to meet me before the throne of the great judge, the God who judges the heart, and knows whether mine has been upright and honest, even in this last deed. To him I appeal my cause. Let him judge between me and thee." He spoke so vehemently, with such a rapid flow of words and sternness of aspect, that no one even dreamed of interrupting him. All seemed horror-struck, paralysed, as it is called, by the terrible event which had just taken place and the strong passion of the young man's demeanour. At length, however, Sir Robert Hardwicke spoke, letting drop Robert Ratcliffe's hand lifeless from his own. "Thou speakest to the dead, unhappy young man," he said. "For many years thou didst my bidding well in everything. Alas, why didst thou not obey unto the end? But it was thy fate. In vain I sent thee to a foreign land. The doom was to be fulfilled." "It was my fate," answered Gaunt Stilling, "and I thank God for it. Now take me hence, put me where you will. I know what I have to undergo, and I will meet it as a man. This heart may throb as if it would burst, but it shall never quail." They laid hands upon him gently and led him away unresisting. The corpse of Robert Ratcliffe was taken up by the servants and removed quietly to another chamber. The guests gazed strangely upon each other, and those the least familiar with the family began to drop away, one by one, begging to be excused to Lady Coldham. These words of ceremony had been repeated once or twice to her eldest son, who had merely bowed coldly, till one flippant woman added, with an inquiring air, "Though we have not had the honour of seeing her ladyship." "There is no such person as Lady Coldham," said the young man impatiently, and the news was whispered round that Lady Coldham was dead, but that this strange family had been going to celebrate the marriage even while she lay a corpse in the house. There was more truth in the rumour than rumours usually have, for Lady Coldham never woke completely from the terrible fit of fainting into which she had fallen. She once made an effort, as if to get up from the bed on which they had laid her, and one of the servants raised her suddenly, but she instantly fell back and expired without a word. This event had already taken place when her son spoke, but he knew it not, and turning his eyes from the departing guests, he looked round for one who had greatly moved his interest that day. Margaret was seated by this time in a distant corner of the room, with her head leaning on Hortensia's shoulder, and her handkerchief pressed upon her eyes. The young man approached her kindly, while another and another of the guests took their departure in silence, and said, "Be comforted, Margaret, be comforted, my dear cousin, for you are still my cousin Margaret. These are sad and terrible scenes for a young and gentle thing like you, but you have borne yourself nobly and well, and I trust a better Lord Coldham will console and repay you for all you have suffered on his account." Margaret started and gazed in his face. "Ay, Margaret," he said, "in the common course of events, Ralph Woodall will soon be Lord Coldham, as his father now is. For myself, I am so no longer, and what will become of me I know not. My mother's small property will but be sufficient for herself, but I have my sword unstained, and my heart unburdened, and I too can carve a way for myself in the world." "Young man," said a voice close to him, while a hand was laid upon his arm, "I have not put you to these bitter trials without motive. You are my son, if you will be so, and heir to all that I possess. Your mother I once loved well, till her imperious temper drove me forth to wander over the world. In her ambition she soon forgot and hated me. I became a captive, a slave, a favourite, a rich merchant, as is often the case in Eastern lands. The liberty which she would not seek for me, I repurchased by my own industry and skill. This estate of Ormbar, good as it is in these lands, is but small to what I possess. If you have lost rank and station, with me you may find affluence and peace, and I promise you, after all I have seen of your noble conduct in such trying circumstances, that you shall ever find the affection of a parent also." The young man grasped his hand and bent his head, and something like a tear stained his cheek. Old Lord Woodall had remained nearly alone in the middle of the room. Some of the guests had come up and spoken to him ere they departed, but he seemed hardly to notice or to hear them, remaining with his eyes bent upon the ground and his arms crossed upon his chest. Suddenly something seemed to move him. He strode across the hall with a rapid step, and took Margaret's hands in his. "Forgive me, my child, forgive me," he said. "Henceforth your fate is at your own disposal. Your father will never seek to mar it again." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. In the same cell in Dorchester jail which had first received Ralph Woodall after his capture, sat Gaunt Stilling on the evening succeeding the events which I have mentioned. He was heavily ironed, but he had a light, a lantern fixed upon the wall at a considerable distance above his head, and by its rays, feeble as they were, he was reading a small book very closely printed. One passage seemed to interest him much, for he read it over 3 or 4 times. It contained a curious and somewhat subtle argument, translated from the Italian, concerning the lawfulness of certain actions according to the circumstances in which men are placed, and it ended in a quotation in Latin of the well-known epitaph of Cardinal Brundusinus: "Excessi e vitae aerumnis, facilisque lubensque, ne pejora ipsa morte, de hinc videam." He was interrupted before he could go further by the entrance of the chief turnkey, who took especial care to look along the passages before he entered, and then closed the door securely behind him. "Has the parson come?" asked Stilling, raising his head suddenly. "No," replied the turnkey, "not yet, Gaunt, but I want to have a little talk with you, and I have brought the light irons, for these are too heavy." "I care not for them," answered Stilling. "What matters it to me whether they are light or heavy? Do you suppose I am going to try to escape?" "No, no, Master Stilling," said the turnkey. "We must have no more escapes." "Ay," said Gaunt Stilling, "yet I could frighten you into opening that door and letting me out in 5 minutes." The turnkey shook his head. "What, not if I could prove you received £80 out of the 350? "You can't prove that," said the turnkey with a grin. "You are mistaken," replied Gaunt Stilling. "Every piece was marked in the presence of a witness, and 5 of them which you spent are easily to be found. There is not one of you, of all the 5 who shared the money, that is not as much in my power as I am in yours. If it depended upon my word, that might be nothing. But remember, there are several others in the business who are now free enough to bear testimony." "But you are too honourable a man to peach," said the turnkey, a good deal frightened. "Honourable," said Gaunt Stilling with a scoff. "But no matter, I don't want to escape, Master Blackstone. I can die one day as well as another, and I do not know any day this last 12-month in which I should not have been quite ready to go. Hanging is not unpleasant, they tell me, and at all events it must be a great deal better than lying for weeks in a sick bed and then going out like the end of a candle." "I'm glad you think so," said the gaoler dryly. "But come, Master Stilling, give me your word of honour that you will not peach of us. You know it was only at your request, and because you were an old friend, that we did what we did." "You have forgotten the 350 golden Jacobuses," said Gaunt Stilling, with a laugh. "Well, well, I must have a better room, and that tonight. I must have a better light, and that speedily. I must have pen and ink and paper to write with. I must have a bottle of wine and cold chicken for the parson. It's a long time till the assizes, and I must make myself comfortable." The turnkey rubbed his head and thought for a moment, for his predicament was somewhat unpleasant. "The best I can do for you tonight, Master Stilling," he said, "is to put you in the little room in the 3rd ward. It has got a good planked floor and a fireplace. You'll be out of my district, but I'll tell you who has got the keys. It is Jones Barstow. You'll recollect him, I dare say. A green hand, mighty fond of strong waters, which, when he gets enough of them, send him sound to sleep. The governor doesn't put many capitals there, for fear Barstow should let them out. He's such a soft one. But I'll speak with the governor and get it done for you." "Very well," answered Stilling. "Set about it quick, and remember, I shall look to you, Master Blackstone, for everything I want." In reason," said the turnkey, and went his way. The governor made some objections, for although Barstow, being a distant cousin of his wife's, enjoyed his favour, yet he had but little confidence in him, and Stilling had been represented to him as a resolute, desperate fellow, requiring the strictest watch. The head turnkey overcame his scruples, however, representing that the man had no thought of escape, and adding that he seems to think hanging rather pleasant than otherwise. "Wait till he tries it," said the governor, laughing. "However, if you are sure of him, put him there, I don't mind." In about half an hour, Gaunt Stilling was in a more comfortable room, and in a few minutes after Dr. Maffili was admitted to him. "Ah, young man," said the good doctor, "this is a sad pass you've brought yourself to. You go on your way all your life, and then you send for the parson." "Sit down, doctor," said Gaunt Stilling, with a look so much gayer than any which Dr. Maffili had seen upon his countenance when they last met, that the worthy clergyman was both surprised and grieved. Nor was his mind much relieved when Gaunt Stilling went on to say, "I didn't send for you, doctor, for the purposes you imagine. I dare say you think I am sorry for what I have done, but there you are mistaken, or that I'm afraid of being hanged, and there you're mistaken again." "You'll be hanged as sure as a gun, and no help for it, my dear boy," said Dr. Maffili. "I'll bet you a bottle of it, and let the longest liver drink it." "I know I shall be hanged," answered Gaunt Stilling, "but what I sent for you for was that you might take down the whole particulars of everything that has happened, exactly as it did happen. I am determined to save judge and jury and lawyers all sorts of trouble, and I shan't give the hangman much either. You've got the paper I sent you. You behaved like an honest man about that, though I believe the law would have had you give it up." "Well, well, perhaps it might," said the doctor, "but the paper didn't tell much, young man. It only said you killed poor Henry Woodall in mistake, and that Master Ralph was never back in Norwich that night. But not a word did you say about how it all happened." "Well, I'll tell you now," replied Gaunt Stilling. "So take your paper and write down my confession. Then I will sign it, and you shall witness it." Dr. Maffili seated himself at the table, dipped the pen in the ink, and dated the paper, saying quietly, "Don't make it too long, lad. About the length of a sermon will do." "You shall have a bottle of wine and a chicken when you've done," replied Gaunt Stilling. "The wine I don't mind," answered the doctor, "but as for the chicken, I've no stomach. The sight of all the passages and locks and bolts, and you here in the middle of them, has taken away my appetite. So fire away, my boy, and make haste." "Young Robert Ratcliffe," said Gaunt Stilling, leaning his head upon his hand, "who always passed for the lawful son of Lord Coldham." "There's another pretty affair," cried Dr. Maffili. "Who would ever have thought that that proud old woman was a— Phew!" "Never mind her," said Gaunt Stilling. "Bad the crow, bad the egg. Put that down. Young Robert Ratcliffe, who passed for Lord Coldham's lawful son, was an insolent, profligate fellow. He had done much mischief in the village, and when I returned from Tangier, I found him often coming to our house and seeing my sister Catherine. Poor unhappy girl, I came too late. I warned him off, told him I would not have him there, and gave him fair notice I would beat him if he came, punish him if he wronged my sister. My father had been foolish enough to think he would marry her, because she was handsome and well taught, and he had a hold upon the old woman by knowing her secrets. The young man one day, too, said that he would marry her, and that was the poor girl's ruin. I knew better than to believe such nonsense, and opened my father's eyes at length, so that he was as eager to move her out of the way of temptation as I was, and we agreed to bring her here to our relations in Dorset. My uncle met her halfway, and she was kept secure enough for that time. But her shame soon became apparent, and when I came over from Norwich to see her, there was no longer any concealment. I had promised revenge, and I resolved to take it, but it was needful to wait my time, when, as if good fortune would have it, chance seemed to throw the opportunity in my way. I heard that there had been a quarrel between young Ralph Woodall, with whom I was, and Robert Ratcliffe, in the ballroom of the Duke's house. I heard that Ralph had dragged him away by the neck from Mistress Margaret when she fainted, and that the villain quitted the room and sent for his cousin Henry. I did not suspect, at that time, that he was altogether a coward, and naturally thought that a duel would follow. That did not please me, for I wanted to punish him myself, and I would have given a great deal to take Ralph's place, for though he is a good swordsman, Robert was fencing all his life, and full of tricks. As I suspected, Robert Ratcliffe's servant Roger came twice seeking Ralph Woodall. The last time he brought a sealed letter. I asked him if it was a challenge, and he said yes, so I naturally thought it came from the man with whom Ralph had quarrelled. My master was then absent, gone with Lady Danvers to Thetford, but he was to be back long before night, and I managed to find out, one way or another, that the duel was to take place by moonlight, and without seconds. I got hold of the place too, and a quick thought passed through my mind, that if Ralph did not return, I would take the opportunity myself. I answered, therefore, boldly, that he would be at the place appointed, adding below my breath, or somebody else in his place. When the knave was gone, I had a strong inclination to look into the letter, but I had heard Ralph speak so highly about the shame of opening letters to other people that I could not bring my mind to do it. I was uneasy, however, for fear he should come back in time, and I rode after him part of the way toward Thetford. He told me he should certainly be back before night, but they had made so little progress it was not likely. And I found out from the Duke of Norfolk's servants that they did not intend to let him come back, for that the Duke had sent him out of the way to prevent his receiving the challenge. I kept it snug in my pocket, therefore, and returned to Norwich, where I remained in a great fright lest he should come. Night fell again, and at 10 o'clock I was upon the ground. Nobody was there, and sitting down upon a bench I fell into a doze, out of which a quick step awoke me at length. It was a foggy night, and though the moon gave some light, one could not see a man's face clearly. The man was of the same height, too, as Robert Ratcliffe, dressed much in the same way, and I was hardly awake. His sword was in his hand when first I saw him, and he said, Come, no words, sir. Draw your sword. On my life, you take it coolly. There was something in the voice that startled me, though I knew neither of their tongues well. But as his sword was out, mine was soon out too. We made 2 or 3 passes, and he pressed me hard, for I had a doubt and wanted to be sure. He beat me out from beneath the trees to a place by the side of the basin where there was more light, and then he seemed surprised and lost his guard just as I was lunging quart over the arm. I had no notion I should hit him, but he did not parry, and the blade went through his body. He was killed in a fair fight, however, and though it was a mistake, it was no murder. The knave Roger, Robert Ratcliffe's servant, can tell you more as to how his cowardly master got Henry Woodall to take the burden off his own shoulders. Dr. Maffili shook his head. Whoso sheddeth a man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, he replied. If this isn't murder, Gaunt-Stilling, I should like to know what the devil it is. Be that as it may, answered Gaunt-Stilling, I was only the more resolved to have vengeance upon that villain Robert. I went to seek him at Sedgemoor when I heard he was there, but I was stopped and prevented, and I heard afterward that he has slunk away from the battle. After that, he continued, I found that poor Master Ralph was in prison, and my heart was torn many ways, for my sister sent for me, and I found her dying. The villain had broken her heart by a letter he wrote her, mocking her claims and making a scoff of her love. She never took heart again, and died a fortnight after the birth of her child. I was resolved, however, that Ralph should not suffer for my deed, if I could help it, and I wrote that paper and brought it to you. I kept myself out of the way, indeed, because I always thought the time for my vengeance would come, and when I heard in Holland that Robert Ratcliffe was going to marry Margaret Woodall, to gain all his ends and objects, and perhaps in time to become Lord Woodall, I made up my mind what I would do. I found out Sir Robert Hardwicke, who went so long by the name of Mortimer. What could make him take such a heathenish name? Asked Dr. Maffili. There is not a Christian letter in it. It is but Ormbar turned another way, replied Gaunt-Stilling. But right away. I did not tell Sir Robert all I intended, though he has ever been kind and generous to me. But he seemed to divine a great deal, and cautioned me to beware. He told me that he intended to claim his own, to bring the adulteress to shame, and dispossess the son of Lord Coldnam, giving Ralph his place, because he had loved his mother when she was young. He said that would be punishment enough, and I hesitated a little. I resolved to make sure, however, for I knew him to be soft-hearted, and I went with my father this morning to Ormbar Castle, where Sir Robert had appointed him to come to bear witness. When I saw the villain, however, come out into the hall with Margaret Woodall to go to the church, my blood seemed to boil up. I had no longer any command over myself, or any scruple, and I killed him. Now don't say a word, good man. There are some offences that the law does not touch. There are some evils that no law will prevent. I have punished the one and have stopped the other. That is my only offence, and I am ready to die for it. If I put those last words down, they'll twist a cord round your throat to a certainty, Gaunt, said Dr. Maffili. Lawyers won't have it that there is anything law can't do, and they always hang a man who preaches the contrary. Put them down, said Gaunt-Stilling. They will make no difference in my fate. Now, give me the paper and I will sign it. You put your name there. We had better have in another witness, suggested Dr. Maffili, and calling the turnkey, he made Gaunt-Stilling read over the whole paper in the man's presence, and acknowledge its accuracy before he signed his name. The chicken and the bottle of wine were then brought in, but good Dr. Maffili was in no mood for either eating or drinking, and after taking one glass to please the prisoner, he retired, promising to visit him again in a couple of days. Some weeks passed without anything remarkable occurring in Dorchester jail, till an early fall of snow took place, on the morning after which the room of Gaunt-Stilling was found vacant. A plank had been taken up in the floor, and extended from the high window, the bars of which had been wrenched out, to a parapet of the doorkeeper's lodge. Thence, for any one to make their escape, a wall some 6 feet high was to be surmounted, and then a leap of 14 or 15 feet into the lane was to be taken. That this had been accomplished was evident by the marks in the snow. The footprints, undoubtedly those of Gaunt-Stilling, were traced for some way on the Weymouth road, till the marks of traffic effaced them. He was never actually heard of more, but in the 4th year of the reign of King William III, some portions of a skeleton, and a complete set of irons covered with rust were taking out of a deep hole in the river way. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. 2 brief scenes more, and I have done. The outline of the one probably the imagination of the reader could fill up. The other, however, would require to be pictured more completely. Let me premise that all applications to King James for assurance that Ralph Woodall would not be prosecuted for the events which had taken place at Thetford were vain, and the king, rampant with his success over Monmouth, only showed a more and more strong determination to persecute all who showed any favours toward dissenters. In vain Lord Woodall petitioned. In vain the young man's father, now Lord Coldenham, urged that his son was a steadfast member of the Church, and had only acted from motive of pure humanity. They knew too well what would be the consequence of Ralph's return to England, and both of them at length went over to pass a few months with him in Holland. When at length William of Orange landed on the shores of Great Britain and marched toward London, one of the most favoured officers in his army was the Honourable Colonel Woodall, and when the crown was placed, by the voice of the people, upon that prince's head, and James himself became an exile, a beautiful and blooming bride sailed gaily over with Queen Mary from Holland, and joined her noble husband at Coldenham Castle. She was beautiful and blooming again, with a certain delicacy of complexion, a want of that high and somewhat rustic health which Margaret Woodall had once enjoyed, gave her husband some uneasiness, especially as her strength did not seem to increase, even in the air of her native land and county. She was very joyous, however, and very happy, and 3 beautiful babes came as blessings to the household. But no happiness can endure long unalloyed. Within the 4 years that followed Ralph's marriage, his father and Lord Woodall both sunk quietly into the grave, and Margaret mourned much for her father. Her colour became less vivid, except at night, and she often visited the old monuments in Coldenham Church, and gazed at several vacant places where there was space for a tomb for 2 more. When people inquired after her health, however, she always said that she was very well, and her husband's eye never but once found a sad look upon her face, except when she was mourning for her father. She was at the moment gazing at her children, and when Ralph bent down his head and kissed her cheek, she put her arms round his neck and whispered a word or 2 in his ear. "There is one whom I should greatly prefer," she said, in conclusion, "if that should happen. You know whom I mean." "Hush, hush, dear Margaret," said Ralph. "You grow gloomy here. We must change this scene, and in the softer air and brighter landscapes of Devonshire find health and spirits for you." Margaret smiled and said that was not needful. She only spoke of what might be. But Ralph carried out his plan, and ere a week was over the whole family were moving gently toward Devonshire. Suppose 2 more years over, reader, and you see once more Lord Coldenham, not yet quite 29 years of age. A lady, a very beautiful lady, is seated in a chair where Margaret used to sit. She is in a travelling dress, and one young child of about 18 months old is pressed close to her breast, and playing among her rich brown hair with its little fingers. 3 others, somewhat older, are clustering round her, and all their young forgetful faces are raised gladly toward her, but the tears are falling rapidly from her eyes, and even her husband turns away toward the window to conceal the drop that has gathered in his own. The next moment he returned and clasped her hand in his without uttering a word, and the lady pointed to the children, saying, "These dear ones do not remember Ralph, and indeed, how should they? But neither you nor I, my dear husband, can ever forget there has been a Margaret. I will do all I can to supply her place, but that can never be completely." "God bless you, my Hortensia," said Ralph, and hurried away from the room. The end. End of chapter 47. End of The Fate, A Tale of Stirring Times by George Payne Rainsford James. Recording by Lynn T. in Tucson, Arizona.